Well, this one is on.
We shifted it.
We just shifted.
Because because then you confuse him. He'll turn them all on. Yep. The first one, you want the first one?
This still doesn't work.
He's gonna turn it on right now.
There.
Richard, how are the sight lines? Can you see everybody?
I can see everybody. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I tell you what, I'll move this closer. How is that? Can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. Okay.
Maybe give them another minute.
Whatever.
Flowing in. Are they flowing in?
Yeah.
Come out of your time, of course.
That's all right.
Just kidding.
My time is your time, so that's all right.
Okay.
Looks good. Yeah, so far so good. Well, I'm going to continue with actually the discussion in the last section about populism. So this is very serendipitous that we follow each other. But I just want to say before that to you, Ned, how grateful I am and other members of the center are for you to have created this amazing institution. And it's been so stimulating to me personally and eye-opening. And it's thanks to you that it existed. So this is a great big thank you to you. I'm going to talk to you about one kind of populism, which has been very much on my mind recently, which is a kind of populism that is embodied by Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom or by Donald Trump here, which is one which is what I call a kind of rule by acting. It's not the whole of populist story, as we've just heard before, but it's one in which performance plays an enormously important role, and performance of a certain kind. If any of you are fellow sufferers from Boris Johnson, you know that he speaks only in cliches, and far be it from me to comment on Donald Trump, but it seems equally that the verbal dimension of what's being said is deeply familiar, indeed almost predictably familiar to what they're doing. So the effort that both of them have in order to rule is to enact by nonverbal means what otherwise would be very boring and familiar cliches. And I'm quite interested in that aspect of enactment. That is how performing of a nonverbal bodily sort can actually do the work of a form of exacting submission from an audience. It's a familiar problem in the arts, but it has this political reflection as well. And to begin to just make clear a little what I mean by this, I'm going to read to you something, just a personal experience of how this works in the realm which I have been working on at the UN for the last 12 years, which is climate change. And what I'm going to describe to you is in the spirit of sociological inquiry. I went a few years ago to a climate change deniers conference at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to explain or try and evoke to you a little the ways in which this kind of nonverbal performativity operates so that we have rule by acting. At this conference, in Trump Hotel, by the way, I gather he's selling it. It's the most garish building. It seemed a fitting home for its name. The most striking group attending this climate deniers convention were some young, rather well-dressed students. And during a tea break, a young woman next in line helped me to sugar. Earnest and soft-spoken, she proved nothing like the stereotype of an intolerant right-winger. After she asked what I did, and I mentioned the words United Nations, she nodded politely. To paper over this unfortunate revelation, she began, as Americans will when meeting strangers, to tell me about herself. A libertarian, she was majoring in Ayn Rand studies at a local college. She's paying for that. She had come with a dozen or so classmates to whom I was introduced in turn, and with whom I then had lunch. Ayn Rand, it transpired, had a lot to do with their interest in climate change. Rand's doctrines are all about individual initiative, and students majoring in Ayn Rand studies are likely to discredit impersonal forces beyond their control, like climate change. At lunch, though, these kids evinced a certain open-mindedness which went well beyond politics. They did not dismiss as fake news my explanation of why each decimal point matters in global warming. But the open-mindedness lasted only until we adjourned for the big events in the ballroom. Then the malign powers of ruling by acting seized hold of the kids, turning them into an acid-angry crowd. Charts flashed by on a giant screen as each speaker proclaimed some version of "the science is a fraud." The fraudsters were absent figures, professors from Harvard and MIT, professional do-gooders at the Rockefeller Foundation, and of course UN bureaucrats. The audience responded by nodding or challenging, "That's right." The charts were often too difficult to read. There was no verbal communication as well, because it was a series of look at that, and an image would flash on the screen and then disappear. The visceral bodily experience of theater kicked in throughout, however, through what country music singers call call and response. Do you know what that is? I call something out, you respond. The Ayn Rand study group, so restrained outside, at first just smiled at the familiar mantra, "It's a fake," then began to clap, then began to chant the familiar lines. My colleague removed her spectacles, her eyes streaming from excitement. But this was not the end of the story. When the call and response ended, the kids' calm good manners and seriousness returned. Indeed, in another tea break, I have to say I was longing for a martini by this point, my companions acknowledged rather shamefacedly that climate change is a real threat. The contrast Freud describes in his group psychology is that as a crowd, the kids became unthinking and let their aggressions hang out, whereas a distinct group of individuals, they return to the realm of sober fact. Theater effected this transformation. That is, it was like pulling a trigger. And I want to explain to you a little about how that works first in terms of a theory that's called the Cohen-Arendt hypothesis, about what was going on in this whole. I hope I'm not talking too long. In a remarkable study of apartheid South Africa, the sociologist Stanley Cohen explored what the white Boer community actually knew about conditions in the townships to which the black majority were confined. Cohen found that the whites, in fact, knew quite a lot about the miseries that the apartheid regime inflicted. But at the same time, they blotted out this awareness, claiming, for instance, that they had never heard about the typhoid epidemics which ravaged the townships, but letting pop out occasionally references to the typhoid scourge. Challenged by the Cohen, the whites said, "I can't handle talking about it." Cohen called this state of denial simultaneously knowing and not knowing. He asserted, and this is what makes this complex, that the more in fact that people understood, the more they had to deny what they knew. It was too overwhelming. Cohen's study reinforced an observation that Hannah Arendt had made decades before about German concentration camps. Ordinary Germans professed to know nothing about them, which Arendt didn't believe for a second. Too many Jews, Catholics, homosexuals, Roma, and socialists had gone missing from the streets. It was not possible for the ordinary German not to wonder about how and where they had gone. This was the same syndrome operating among the young climate deniers. The facts were overwhelming. Theater of this particular sort enabled them to deny the reality. But the theater could not erase truth. Rather, as with the South African whites and the German civilians, art suspended truth. More, the theatrical device of call and response was aggressive, mocking, as though they had seen through the establishment, scientific and institutional, them, the power. Now, it's this way of mobilizing the anger that you were speaking about, populist anger, which is not rooted, it's a sociological and psychological root rather than something which could be traced back to capitalism. And it's one of the, in particular, and it's one of the reasons that I think that in looking at the whole phenomenon of populism, that the effort to tie it to economics is a little strained. There are different parameters which are coming into play in this kind of populist view. For the same reason, the discussion, as we heard in the previous talk, about migrants is a kind of suspicious, if it were a one vector analysis of what provokes this kind of aggression. The aggression is provoked by the experience of being in a theatrical situation where you become a participant. And because I think the major threats to us now as a polity lie in this kind of populist thing, it's important to understand what is fundamental to it. The condition that Stan Cohen and Hannah Arendt point to is one that really calls into question a whole Enlightenment mindset, which was that the more people know about something, the more they will embrace its reality. That is, that factually, that the project of enlightenment is a process of reason making and reason strengthening. I think that's quite naive, that what this little example I've given you about, or the Cohen-Arendt hypothesis, point to, is that the more that people are armed rationally with fact, that the more angst that it produces, and the desire for something to deny the facts that they know perfectly well. In other words, the proposition would be that there's a paradox here, that the more rationality that you seek to arouse in a public, the more this syndrome of denial through theatrical behavior comes, but it comes as only temporary relief. It doesn't erase it. And it's a very important thing to know about the kind of populism I'm talking about. These are not ignorant people. That's a kind of condescending way of thinking about the problem that this kind of rule by acting is engaging. It's creating a mechanism for emotional denial at the same time which offers temporary relief for a condition which people know perfectly well. I have to say that, how much time do I have? I have to say that it points, with the value of hindsight, to, I think, a huge error that we made in the UN and that other environmentalists have made. And that was the error of talking about climate change as climate disaster. Because what that provokes is, by trying to overwhelm people with the reality, with the facts of what things are, it provokes the desire to deny. It's not that it erases those facts, but it creates a sociological and performative palette in which people resist by both knowing and not knowing, of being absent. The rhetoric of climate change that it also evokes the notion of, well, if there's nothing you can do about it, it doesn't matter. You know, it creates kind of passivity, which is terrible. So that when I've thought about this as it's affected it's more than rhetoric. It's the way in which we've tried to energize from COP15 on the public, that focusing on the disastrous nature of the facts has been a way to grow the climate denier movement. It's had that counterproductive effect. And we needed to have found another way of speaking about this, which is one that didn't kick in the opportunity to rule by acting in this domain. It's for the same reason that, as you'll know if you followed COP26, which is in Glasgow, we had a little one of those mercury balls, you know, that falls down, and at a certain point, it's too late, and adaptation becomes more important than mitigation. I don't know if you ever saw this. This wasn't my invention. It was one of the most gifted people on my staff. Once that little ball fell below the notion where there was no mitigation would be insufficient, you had to adapt instead to climate change. We kicked in exactly the mentality of saying, I'm going to deny this, because there was no agency that was given to people to deal with. As a final note about this, I would say that that is correct, however, that we have passed a point of no return. But oddly enough, in order to enable people to take some action, that fact itself has become a kind of disabling fact for us. And we no longer talk, as you'll see on Wednesday when we give a report to the UN General Assembly, we don't use this language anymore. We've learned from this that this whole syndrome is something that rebounds on enlightened people, which I think we all are, to disable their ability to act. So that's what I wanted to say about this. I don't know, do we have time for a question? I have to go back downtown, but I'd love to.
I guess it's up to you then.
Well, it's one of those days, but it's. Do you have any comments on this? Does it make sense to you what I'm saying? It's philosophically, it's of course very depressing, because the truth of things is also something that is a provocation of an untruth through this kind of behavior. Yeah.
Are you saying then that it's that we've engendered a sense of powerlessness, and that this reaction of populism, denialism, is a way of exerting control, even if it's negative control?
Yes, you could look at it that's a very interesting way to put it. That is, that it, as in this little thing in the Trump Hotel, those kids as a mass felt empowered by this. It's a very interesting way to put this. As students of Ayn Rand studies, of course, that shouldn't have been, because you're not supposed to groupthink. But yes, that's a good way to put it. And it's a dilemma. We have to deal with this crisis. And I was very struck this year, for instance, that we did a calculation, which we're going to explain on Wednesday, about excessive deaths due to heat stroke, particularly in people my age, elderly people like me. It's a huge number, but it was very seldom reported in the press because it's such a huge number that it's kind of overwhelming. People can't deal with it, And that's the dilemma we're getting in. Trump's supporters are energized. They're far more energized, I think. I'm a Bernie Sanders man, I guess. They're far more energized than we are, And as you put it that way, that's probably it gives them agency in a way.
So how do we energize us?
You want to come work for me? I don't know. I really don't. What I've understood is, since COP15, we were so focused on trying to get the word out that we took this path that led us into this impasse. And now we've got to find another way of dealing with this. I noticed somebody this morning said that the way up is local, and that's nonsense, because this is a crisis that has absolutely, there are local things you can do. You can turn off your air conditioner, but if 4 million other people have their air conditioners on, that's an empty gesture. So part of the politics of this is figuring out truly collective action across borders, although nation states have a real role to play in it. But it is a problem of collective action, which is not doesn't fall into the trap of this Freud group psychology, where people erase their capacity to reason when they get in a group. Yeah.
So are you actually saying that calling this, using the word disaster on the climate thing, that makes it even more difficult to attack that or to deal with this, because it creates the feeling there's nothing we can do about this,
Yeah.
and it's at the end of the day it exactly leads to the contrary of what was
Exactly.
envisaged.
Yeah, that's what I've experienced with this. We need a different language to talk about disaster. We have somebody now working on speeches that people were giving in 1940 in Berlin, in London, about the bombings in London. And it's interesting that that language is not the language of climate disaster. It's something else. This is a problem. These are real threats. It happens every night. Here's what you do. And there's a kind of cynicism on the left also about this, which has been terrible for us. Greta Thunberg, for instance, has been, I think, really what, in my view, she did something good in the beginning, but she's become a terribly counterproductive voice in trying to deal with this problem. Another analogy you can think about this is, and it's something I'd like to pursue in the future, is when a doctor is faced with a terminally ill patient, what's the language between them? That also might give us some clues. A good doctor dealing with somebody who is terminally ill, because we are terminally ill, you know, and this is not a problem that can be talked away. We have gone beyond that tipping point. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or comments around why the language that we've been using around climate change, for example, resonates with what it sounds like a lot of people in this room, but maybe not with others? Like, what's that distinction?
Say again, just so I understand.
Yeah, no, just sort of abstracting from your talk, just it sounds like there are terms and terminologies that overwhelm people when it comes to talking about
Right.
disasters. And so, but it sounds like that's a subset of people. Because, for example, when it comes to climate change, there's a very large subset of people who those facts and figures are not overwhelming, they're empowering. And they're a call to action.
Actually, I think I disagree with you.
Okay, fair enough.
I've been surprised by how sporadic the climate change movement has been. There are people who are, you know, deeply involved in this day by day. But for instance, to have a climate change protest is good if you mobilize people to then act. When the protest itself becomes the activity, you know, I held up my sign and so on, which is what is increasingly happening. You're not building organizations like Extinction Rebellion by protests. We have a whole bunch of NGOs that we're associated with, and they're just not growing because this protest it's taken another form in which somehow this, which I think comes out of the notion that this is basically a power relationship, and if you got to the people, for instance, who own the petrol companies, if you protest against them, something will good will happen against that. It's beyond that. The companies have to be dismantled, you know. They have to be forbidden to do their business. I guess I am talking about capitalism. You know, it's not a question of raising their moral tone. Every businessman I've talked to sees climate change as the most important you know, issue of our generation. They all say it. They all walk the walk and talk the talk, whatever it's called. But they don't shut down their businesses. So, I mean, part of dealing, if we really wanted to deal with this, would be to nationalize and redistribute those businesses. That's not going to happen. You know, so, I mean, it is, you know, it's a question of where the reality of this lies. And we're not dealing with it so far, very well. I think the language does matter. You know, I think the language, as with any political thing, language has to be mobilizing to people in a way which leads to action. And that's, I don't know, maybe I'm too frustrated about this. I've done this too long, so.
All right, I think we do have to end there
Yeah, I'm sorry.
for several
I have
reasons.
to go
But thank you so much.
downtown, too. Thank you.
Come back for an evening if you can.
I will. My main problem is getting the traffic. The traffic around you and
Uber is extremely good at handling traffic.
First one, right?
I'll see you all later.
There it is.
And then you can just use either the keypad or the clicker.
This one? Yes?
You can use this one if you want.
No, I don't need it. I can use this.
Perfect.
Okay. Well, first of all, I cannot fully express my gratitude to Ned, not only for inviting me here at the 20th anniversary of the center, but for being able to participate in the celebration of your round birthday. This is really what is, I think we met in 1985 when you came to the Bank of Italy. You came in 1985 visiting to the Bank of Italy, and I was the one who had decided to invite you. And I remember having lunch with you in a small restaurant near the Bank of Italy. And every time going in, I was saying, when you win the Nobel Prize, we're going to write it on the shop. The shop is no longer there, but you did win the Nobel Prize. So I really want to voice my great affection for you together with Daniela, and the pleasure of having the privilege to be here. I'm going to tell this a short story. Short also because I thought I had less time than I've been assigned to speak, but that's all right. It's worse when you speak too much than when you speak too little. It's a story of the Italian economy that is very much in the spirit of Ned's work. Ned has taught us that growth and prosperity depend on entrepreneurial spirit, I'm quoting, and a chronic and endemic indigenous innovation. It depends on creating room in societies for individuals to think for themselves, find adventure, let free their imagination, and journey into the unknown. Accordingly, he sees slowing growth and productivity as a failure of society. To breed innovation and individual creativity, a failure that may sometimes lead to a crisis in democracy. And the story I'm telling you about the Italian economy fits over the past 30 years, but I'll show you the long picture, fits very much within this approach. So, how can I, okay, I have it. First of all, you can see here what extraordinary feat Italy did between unification and, well, the year 2000, if you want, or what have you. Italy in 1861 was an extremely poor country. The riches of the Renaissance had gone, long gone. And with, look, life expectancy, 30 years, first year death rate, children death rate, 289, income distribution, Gini coefficient 50%, 0.5, people in absolute poverty, 40% of the population, and literacy rate, 22%. And in the early 2000s, we were like France and Germany, basically, okay? Per capita income, GDP per capita, 25,000 euros or dollars is about the same. Life expectancy, first year death rate, income distribution, people in absolute poverty, and literacy rate, as you see. So an extraordinary feat. Until basically the middle of the 90s. And then the machine somehow stopped. The mechanism for growth basically has broken down. And we are still a rich, prosperous country, but we're a prosperous country that over the past 25 years has gone nowhere. Zero growth. And look, up until you see here the kind of convergence that we've been able to achieve. You can see that in 1995, basically, we were almost like Germany, France, and like the United Kingdom, who had been performing less well. We managed to become a rich and prosperous country. Then we stopped. And if you look at the data that you have here of Italy's GDP per capita as percentage of GDP per capita in 4 other developed countries, we basically have already fallen back to where we were after the war, in relative terms. So I think you understand that this is quite a dramatic change. It's not simply a difficulty, okay? We are back to where we were in the 1950s. And I think there is an insufficient understanding of what is happening and whether or not this crisis is permanent. Whether there are things that we can do, whether it's an accident, or whether something fundamental has happened, okay? Now I will call your attention, of course Italy has suffered all the diseases of the other advanced countries, okay? There is discontent, there is immigration, there is a sense of loss of identity, there is fear. So in this we are like the others. But I'm trying to argue that we have a special disease. There are 2 things that I would like to call to your attention. The first one is that in the past 30 years, the large industry has basically closed or moved away from Italy. It has disappeared. Is no longer there. And the average company size continues to diminish. Look at this little table 3. well, if I can manage to keep it there. What you see there is that the share of employees working in companies with more than 1,000 employees for the total economy has fallen from 19 to 14%. In construction, it has fallen from 7% to 1.5%. In manufacturing, from 22% to 15%. In construction, there is also a collapse of an intermediate layer of companies that you see those between 50 and 100 and medium-sized construction companies whose share in employment basically fell by 2/3. Okay, so the first really dramatic thing is the disappearance of the large industry. And this decrease in size doesn't seem to stop. You don't have it in the data that I'm showing you here. What's wrong here? Next. Okay. I don't have the data here. These are the census data. But if you look at the ensuing census, the decrease in size, in company size, is continuing. And this is a unique phenomenon about advanced countries. It doesn't happen elsewhere. The second thing to which I want to call your attention is, of course, the explosion of public debt. Why do you get all this debt? In an environment in which growth is slowing down continuously. You see the dotted lines in the decades from 1980 to 2010 going down to 0 to all practical purposes. Now, what has happened? What has happened is that basically Italy went through, where is it? A period of very harsh social unrest in the 1970s. Now, this is not without explanation. Growth had been achieved with cheap labor and enormous displacement of labor from the south to the north in very harsh working conditions and often living conditions. Okay? But at the end of the 70s, at the end of the 60s, you get a sort of general revolt in industrial relations. Violent industrial relations that continue for a decade and that basically made the functioning of large enterprises that compromised the function of large enterprises, and which must be seen as the main reason why the large enterprises either closed down or walked away. The political system, so the companies reacted by downsizing or going out. The political system reacted by trying to finance rather than adjust this equilibrium. The simple idea was we subsidize everything that we can to maintain labor and contract conditions out of the market, incompatible with the market. It was a very simple solution. We subsidized everything that we can subsidize to continue out of market conditions. So these are the two main developments that shaped, in my view, the evolution of the Italian economy. Now, cultural legacies of these developments. First, widespread hostility to capitalism and the market economy. With, in addition, a specific connotation, which is very strong resistance to mechanisms of selection of human resources, of companies in the market, of supply contracts in a very large public sector, based on merit, quality, and competence. The effect of what we saw is the idea that much of the society became hostile to market mechanisms. And this has affected deeply our societal culture. It is widespread sentiment in our society. On the other hand, the reaction of family capitalism, as you know, we have a strong system of family companies, was to close up, avoid to open their capital to outside investors, keep a tight grip on the management of business, and thus failing to bring into their companies the managerial competencies required to manage new IT technologies. This evolution was anticipated over 2 decades ago by then Columbia professor Mark Rowe. He's now moved to Harvard. He's a lawyer, a legal expert, who saw that such a close corporate governance system, he saw it as the result of widely divergent values between company owners, the capitalists, and the rest of society. Because the distance between values is so broad, you basically manage the companies with your family members and don't open your capital to outsiders because there is no trust. It is as simple as that. So we come to the explanation. Several decades of low investment and weak technology seems thus to be related to a systemic lack of confidence and closure to surrounding society by the family companies and a widespread anti-market social culture. These are features specific to Italy that in a way distinguishes our economy from the other advanced European countries. Now, why stop then? Well, it is very simple. To do certain things, small is beautiful. And for a long time, you know, we sort of celebrated our small companies as the solution, as our specific solution to growth. But when IT technology arrives, it doesn't work anymore. You crash against the fact that you cannot manage IT with a small size and these rudimental management structures centered on family members. And so, lack of trust was in addition aggravated by recurring episodes of acute political and financial instability generated by higher and higher public debt. Because every now and then, financial markets question whether we can sustain this debt. Normally, we need then harsh adjustment measures, cut here and there, change the conditions for investment and profitability. And of course, people remember, investors remember, and companies remember. So Italy found itself unable to cope when the IT revolution arrived in the middle of the 90s. And the structural weaknesses that I have described, that structure of company management and capital, the inefficiency of the public sector, and the general attitude hostile to market process and new technology combined to bring our economy to a complete halt. So, but this is not the end of the story. As Ned had forecast and let's say imagined, this thing is not without cost for the support to democracy. It's gone. No, It's still there. We still support democracy a little bit. You see what happens. Apparently Spain is suffering a little bit like us, but Italy has become the country with the highest dissatisfaction with democracy and confidence in change within the European Union. And the political system in the end produced as the result a right-wing government which was unthinkable with this composition and this kind of people 10 years ago. And here you see the danger. Without growth, support for democracy diminishes, and in the end, you find yourself governed by unlikely people, let's say. I think this is the story I wanted to tell. Well, I was not too short. I can stop here.
He might have a blank slide at the end. Check the slide.
How are you?
I'm good.
Busy years, right?
That's me.
Okay.
You found it. And apparently they looked okay. I'll take a quick look through them.
Sure. We won't put it up until you're ready.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You just let us know, okay?
Up to you. Yeah. You want to give them a 2-minute break?
Up to mine because people will start, you know, and then it becomes.
You're the boss. I just give the talk. Okay. I'm going to put on my timer. Oh, good. Love it. Don't start till I start. Okay, I think we're running a little ahead of schedule, and I've been encouraged to start. I'm Mark Schultz. I'm a psychologist. I come from another neighborhood, different than economics. I also came up here from Philadelphia. Really honored to be here. Interesting symposium. I appreciate the invitation, Professor Phelps and the center. Quite an institution you have going here, and part of what I'm going to talk about today is another institution that's been going on for 85 years. So I'm really pleased to be here to talk about it. I'm going to start with a story about two of the participants in this study that has been going on for 85 years. And I'm going to introduce them to you. By the way, I'm hoping to leave time for questions. I'm looking carefully at my timer, so I'm going to encourage you to think and to join in the discussion at the end. So on the left is a man named John Marsden, and John grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He was in a family that was a relatively wealthy family in the dry goods business. He was a really good student in school, really interested in ideas. He was also teased a lot when he was in school, what we would now call bullied as he grew up. He was a good enough student. He went on to go to Harvard University. He became a philosophy major, continued to think about ideas, and was really quite stimulated by that. Did really well at Harvard. Decided early on he wasn't going to pursue the family business, was going to go in a different direction, and for him that was law, which he did eventually. World War II intervened. He volunteered to serve in the military but didn't pass the medical exam, so he served stateside during the war. And after the war, went to the University of Chicago, graduated at the top of his class, worked at a leading law firm, taught for a while as well, consulted with the government, led what we would think about conventionally a very successful career. He married a little late for this cohort. John, I should have said, was born in the 1920s. He married at age 34. Leo on the right was a child of Vermont, of New England, grew up in Vermont in a family that was upper middle class. He too was a good student, ended up at Harvard. He was a history major. He loved writing and dreamed of being a writer and a journalist, was what he really wanted to do. He was asked to join the study that I'm going to describe in his sophomore year. World War II broke out about the same time when he was in school. He volunteered and served in the Navy in the Pacific Theater for several years. He kept very detailed notes of that experience while he was serving in the military with the hopes that he would be able to publish something when he was finished his war service. His dad unfortunately died during the war, and right at the end of the war when he came home, his mom developed Parkinson's, got diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So Leo moved back to Vermont to help out his mom and to help his family out. Soon after, he started teaching high school at a local high school. He started teaching history, and he was a beloved teacher for 40 years. He never left that job. So his hopes of becoming a writer were not pursued. He was not able to do that. He met the love of his life soon after he moved to Vermont, so he was younger than John when he married. His wife, Grace, was someone that remained an important person in his life for his entire length of his life. The study that I'm about to describe characterized Leo in this way in one of the first meetings of Leo when he was at Harvard at school. The interviewer says, "I came away from our visit with the impression that the subject was, well, somewhat ordinary." So let me describe their life in a little more detail from the way that we were able to follow them in the study. We followed them up at age 50, and one of the questions we asked was what they were earning, and not surprisingly, John, who was the lawyer, was earning more than almost 3 times as much as Leo, the school teacher. We asked them the question, life has more pain than pleasure. John said true, Leo said false. I often feel starved for affection. John said true, Leo said false. A man feels good, this was a fill in the blank, a man feels good when, John reported, he's able to respond to inner drives. And this was something John talked a lot about, coming to realize his true self and to pursue his interests, very much focused on his kind of inner experience. Leo gave a very different answer. He senses that his family loves him despite everything. A little bit later, now age 62, 1987, we're getting more recent. When you're upset emotionally or sad or worried about something that is not related to your wife, what do you do? John, and by the way, this was John's second wife at this point, John says, I keep it to myself, I tough it out. Leo, I go talk to my wife. It's very natural. I certainly don't keep it to myself. She's my confidant. And finally, when they were age 79, near 80, we asked them to describe, and using 5 adjectives, the nature of their relationship with their partner. John, again in a second marriage, what he described as loveless, offered these 5 adjectives: tension, distant, dismissive, intolerant, and painful. Leo, very different and quite beautiful, comforting, challenging, feisty, pervasive, and beautiful. So let me just summarize, and I'm very aware of where I am and what the main focus of today is. John Marsden, very successful at work, top of his competitive profession, high earner, conventionally very, very successful, very focused on himself, divorced, estranged from his second wife, estranged from his family, relatively unhappy in this large sample, over 700 people, and very disconnected. Leo DeMarco, on the other hand, had to make big compromises in his life. He became a beloved teacher, by the way, quite embedded in his community, loved by students and by colleagues. Thought about himself primarily in relation to others, married throughout his life, strong ties to his children and his grandchildren. So 2 takeaways before I get to any data here. Connections are important, and rich people can be miserable as well. Let me tell you about the origins of the study. This was a study that began in the 1930s, a time I don't need to remind this group about, but I often do when I talk to younger folks. We were still in the throes of the Depression. It was the eve of World War II. An unusual thing happened in Boston. 2 separate studies began, both with a focus on human thriving. So not what was going wrong, but an attempt to understand human flourishing. The first study was a study of inner-city adolescent boys facing real adversity. So these were boys that were growing up in the toughest neighborhoods of Boston, the poorest neighborhoods, mostly in tenement buildings. Most of them were children of immigrants facing real challenges and certainly the experiences of being marginalized. Across town in Boston, on the outskirts at Cambridge, were 268 sophomores in consecutive years at Harvard that were chosen at that time to study normal development. Someone had the idea that Harvard students were normal. And they were followed also for the reasons that I suggested, to try and understand human thriving and how people develop. So very different contexts and possibilities or prospects for life. All 724 were followed across their entire lives, so into adulthood, middle adulthood, late life, in fact, to their death. The study is ongoing, so we've expanded the study along the way to include partners of the original participants, and we're now studying more than 1,300 of their children. So this has been going on for over 85 years now, and it's still an active enterprise. Very briefly, this was a study from the beginning that was really interested in trying to understand people's experience, what was going on inside their head. You didn't start my timer. What was going on inside people's heads, and what their daily experience was of life. So they were followed very closely, interviews of all of the participants, interviews of the parents, observations of these adolescents or young men interacting with their parents, questions for the parents about what the kids were like. And throughout the study, that kind of close, intense study was a feature of the study. Medical exams, they were poked and prodded in a number of ways, which I'm happy to talk more about if there are questions. And then during the next intervening 8 decades now, regular questionnaires about every 2 years, lengthy questionnaires they filled out, mostly closed-ended questions that psychologists ask with a focus on thriving, but also opportunities for them to answer open-ended questions and to tell them what we were missing, and they did. They often told us what we were missing. Interviews at least every 15 years, often closer to 10 years. In the last 20 years, more modern techniques that psychologists and neuroscientists are using. So we scan their brains while they're doing various activities. We looked at the shape and size of different structures in their brains. We collect blood to get a sense, a window into how they're doing physically. And we also bring them into the lab to both observe them interacting with people that are close to them and also stress them out and see how they react, their bodies react, and how they react emotionally to those stresses as well. Best stressor for people in the lab is speaking in front of others. A few lessons. This is really about longevity, and I'm just going to say this quickly because I think it's so important. This study, as well as many others, make it very clear we want to take care of our body like we're going to live in it for 100 years. So what does that mean? We don't want to smoke. We want to limit the amount that we drink in terms of alcohol. We want to exercise, and we want to visit the doctor. The more germane lessons for our focus today is that social factors matter in this study and in many other studies. And I'll give you an example quickly of social status, and then I'm going to focus the rest of my time on connections and relationships with others. This is a simple figure here in purple on my computer here. It's the inner city boys as they grew up, and in red are the college young men as they grew up. And what we're looking at on the y-axis here is the percentage of the cohort that either had died or was significantly disabled, that they were having trouble with the tasks of daily living. And what you see is a clear divergence in these curves, so that at age 65, they diverge by about 30 percentage points. So this is an indication that inequality has a cost. There's also a big educational difference here. Only 25 people in that 400-plus group of inner-city boys made it to college, whereas most of those Harvard men, in fact, all of them graduated from college eventually. So disparities exist. They're tied to socio-demographic factors that we know about from lots of other studies. A few years ago, my colleague, who is the director of the study, I'm the associate director of the Harvard study, we decided to step back and try and think about, across the hundreds of findings in the study, is there a kind of signal? Is there a common sort of robust connection that we can make? And this was the signal that we saw very clearly. I'm just going to give you 4 headlines. If we look at trying to predict psychological and physical health in one's 80s, the best predictor is midlife relationship satisfaction. It's not cholesterol level, it's not income level, it has to do with your connection, in this case to an intimate other. Childhood parenting matters. So across 60, 70 years in the study, the initial ratings that folks did in the 1930s when the studies began of what that childhood environment was like help predict the quality of people's relationships late in life. It also predicts the way they cope with adversity as well. It's a 6-decade prediction, which is quite amazing. It's a modest connection, but it's there. Time spent in this study and many other studies, the more time you spend with others, the happier you report yourself being. Of course, the relationship is likely bidirectional, but this is a common finding. The quality of your relationships in your 80s predicts something about your cognitive decline 3 years later. This is particularly true for women. Folks who are in more secure, more satisfying intimate relationships showed less cognitive decline 3 years after we had measured the quality of their interaction. So these are just 3 findings, but they point to a similar idea that connections matter. I'm going to show you some data from outside the Harvard study just to show that it's not peculiar to the folks that grew up in Boston. I want to do a Boston accent, but I don't do it well. And it's not peculiar to folks that grew up almost 100 years ago. So this is a study of studies, a meta-analysis of the factors that predict premature death. Hard to see maybe for this group, but at the bottom are the usual suspects: hypertension, obesity going up, physical activity, alcohol consumption, smoking. The length of the bars or the width of those bars suggests how much risk that confers for premature death. What's missing here is social connection, which is really at the top of this. So if we look at the risk associated with social connection, it's similar to the risk that we associate with those clear physical health factors for premature death or for the amount of time, the length of your life, the longevity of your life. I'm going to show you data from another study here. This is a famous study that was published in Science in 1988. It's also a study of studies. It's 5 different studies, each with multiple samples. It's a little complicated, but I just want you to focus for now on the y-axis, and we're going to look at 2 of those studies. On the top are data from Evans County, Georgia, which is a rural county west of Savannah. And what you see here, just focusing on the y-axis, is that blacks in Evans County, Georgia, are more likely to die at any age. They have a higher risk of dying than whites in Evans County, Georgia. We can also turn that around to longevity figures. Whites are more likely to live a longer life than blacks in Evans County, Georgia. We can contrast that with Finland, where people are less likely to die at any age and they're going to live a longer life. So we see, again, clear disparities. Complicated to think about the differences between those 2 places, but clear disparities. But that's not what I want folks to focus on here. The x-axis is important, and these are indicators of social connection, how connected people are, measured in lots of different ways: how many friends, how many confidants you have, do you have good friends, do you have the support you need. It's measured differently across these studies. They all show a similar negative relationship here, which means that people who are more socially connected have less risk of dying at any age. So we see this across countries, across different types of studies, and across time. So Bob Waldinger and I decided we had enough of a signal here and across the many studies that have happened internationally at this point to write about this. And our book is, sounded like a good title until I came to this symposium. Everyone's been talking about the good life, but it's called The Good Life. Simple conclusion is that good relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout the lifespan. I want to emphasize, even though I've given a lot of examples about intimate relationships and they're important, it's all kinds of relationships that are important. I want to talk very briefly about loneliness because it's an important public health topic. So the UK was sort of ahead of the US in 2018 because of concerns about social disconnection and the risk for health problems. They appointed a minister-level person in charge of the loneliness portfolio. In the US, back in May this year, our Surgeon General announced a crisis in social disconnection. So this is similar to the advice that's been offered about smoking and cancer. And Vivek Murthy talked about this as a crisis because of how prevalent loneliness is, estimates as high as 50% in most modernized, industrialized countries. Varies from 20 to 50% depending on the study. but also because of the high risk. Those figures that I showed you for the link between connection and health outcomes are true for loneliness as well. Okay, in the remaining few minutes of my talk, I want to turn a little bit to work and tell you what we've learned from this study about work and maybe one part of the good life. And the first thing that's important to recognize is that most of us spend a lot of our adult time working, that a lot of our adult life is engaged in pursuits related to work. So that has some implications. One is it's an important source of meaning for people, and it also is an important source of what our experience of daily life is like. So I want you to recall John and Leo. Both of them would say they were very satisfied with their job. So John, despite being unhappy, talked a lot about his success and his commitment to sharing his knowledge. He, by all characterizations, I think would be seen as a successful worker. Leo lived a very different life, earned way less money, didn't do what his, as young people talk about today, didn't pursue his bliss. His bliss was to write, and he ended up being a teacher in a local high school. He was surrounded by others, interacted with them in meaningful ways, so he made work an important part of this kind of embedded social connections that I think buoyed him through his life. We asked participants at age 80, we followed them again across the decades. At age 80, we asked them their biggest regrets, and there is a kind of aphorism out there that no one on their deathbed talks about wishing they had worked more. It's not fully true here. At age 80, there were women in this cohort who grew up in the 20s and 30s and 40s who wish they had been more selfish and had spent more time working and pursuing their interests. But the vast majority of people talked about one primary regret, that they had let relationships wither in some way, that they hadn't paid enough attention to relationships, hadn't invested enough, and they hadn't been kind to some of the important people in their life, partners, children, coworkers, you name it. Quite extraordinary to read through these regrets. So work can be a prime ground for social connections, but there's some challenges here in the work world, and I think I'm talking to people who know this, but I want to give you my perspective. One is that many people talk about being stressed out from work, huge demands on their time and their attention. One of the challenges in today's world in terms of connection is paying attention to others, and if our attention and our energy is sapped by work, it's hard to connect. Cell phones and other technologies connect us 24/7 to work these days, so it can be really hard to detach from that. So that's another potential deconnector or anti-connector. I want to just highlight remote and hybrid work, and I'm not going to offer a solution here, but just to recognize that there are real compromises here. So one of the earlier speakers said something about the advantages of remote work for women. Absolutely true. For people who have young children, for people who are commuting long distances, there are huge advantages to remote work. On the other hand, there are costs to it as well, and the costs often come in the form of social connection, that serendipitous, water cooler conversation or coffee conversation, very hard to replicate with the technologies that we have now. The technologies are also incredible. They proved how important they were during the lockdown parts of the pandemic. They're incredibly important for connecting us, but they're different than in-person communication. We're learning this more and more. We're doing some research on this. And the affect, the emotion in those virtually mediated conversations is lower. Some people say great, but affect connects us. And what's also lowered is that we only have a picture of people's torsos typically. And what that means is we can't really see the full bodily expression, the nuanced body language. We're also missing the synchrony that we often enjoy in person. So we're missing something right now. The technologies may figure out a way to meet that, but for now, they're not the same, the experiences that people are having in that technology world. It's not just remote work that we need to think about. So this is intended to be a picture, I think it is, of an Amazon warehouse. And people can go for miles working in these warehouses at night and not see other people. So many people are quite isolated in the work environments that they're in. I work at a university. People are coming back gradually still from the pandemic, and many of my colleagues talk about feeling isolated and disconnected, even though we live in a very social environment. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, maybe it's irony, young people in college report some of the highest rates of loneliness as well, and my colleagues are reporting that they're feeling lonely these days. So it's not just the Amazon warehouse workers that face isolation at work. So a few thoughts about improving social fitness, things that we can do. Spaces and places to interact are important. Maybe we'll get to them virtually eventually with new technologies, but they're often physical. So in workplaces, we're talking about cafeterias, gyms, daycare, people bond when they have children. In communities, it's community gardens, green spaces, libraries, playgrounds. These are places not just where people come to gather, but they do activities in which they're in close proximity to others. That's how we often make new acquaintances and friends. Policies and procedures that foster social connections, so everyone needs to think about that, particularly that are leading, whatever work environment they're in or whatever environment they're in. It could be a school environment. And we need to balance important, comparisons. I've heard a lot of discussion about efficiencies. Technology brings efficiencies, but we also need to balance that with the benefits of connection as well. And lastly, really important for leaders to model behaviors about social connections. So, starting meetings, talking about human experience and what days have been like, really important. Sharing those aspects of it, including people in your team in a way that humanizes them and allows them to be seen and heard, I think is an important part of this effort. So I'm going to close there and leave some time for questions. I think we're pretty good, yeah. So questions or discussion? Thank you.
Hi, very interesting. Can you talk a bit about the role of social media for people who are lonely? Is it a slight improvement, a negative? What's the effect?
I think we're trying to get to the point now where we're a little more nuanced than saying thumbs up or thumbs down. So what I want to say is one of the challenges of social media, which is well known to folks, is it promotes social comparison. In the old days when we grew up, when I grew up at least, to figure out whether the neighbors had more than you had to kind of look at your house, look down the street, see what their car is. Now we have an entire landscape from around the world of things that people have, and they're obviously selective and highly curated in what they show us. So the social comparison part tends to make people miserable. We tend to compare ourselves to an unreasonable standard. The general idea that's coming out of research is that if we use social media for social comparison, if we scroll through and see all the things we missed, we're going to get less happy. But if we use it to connect with others, we have the potential for becoming happier. So that's one of the hints there. Again, I think these technologies will evolve. The social media companies are working really hard to try and figure out new ways of connecting people. Whether the incentives will be there or not is another question, but they're working really hard on it.
Hi. Question about the names and photographs of the two people you started with. Are those real? They're not.
So the names are not real. The stories I told you are substantively true, but I disguised some of the details. So we have commitments to the 724 original participants and the 1,300 new participants to protect their privacy. And that's partly how we've had 84% participation rate across 85 years for the study.
So the photographs are also not real?
One of them is real, but I won't tell you which one. One of them I have permission to use.
Okay.
We'll get to everybody, but just have one.
Thank you. So all this talk about connection, and you mentioned you focused on the intimate connections. Could you talk a little bit about how you're measuring that, or like thinking about the quality of these relationships?
Yeah, so great question. So again, the question is about how we measure intimate connection, but I want to emphasize that it's all types of connection. So one of the important questions we asked in the study was, if you're scared or sick in the middle of the night, do you have someone you can call? So many people said yes, and some people who are married and had an intimate partner next to them said, I can't think of anyone I could depend on in that context. So we measure the quality of relationship in lots of different ways. We ask them to describe it for us. How satisfying is the relationship? What kind of support do you have? How much conflict do you have? We bring them into the lab and we literally get them to argue about a topic so we can watch how they resolve conflict. We ask them to talk about fears that they have, and again, we're watching for their ability to navigate what can be very challenging fears. So late in life, we ask them about fears, and many of the fears had to do with health and whether one partner would go first or the other. So we ask them to talk about that. We videotape it. Sometimes we collect some physiology data while we're doing that as well. So the answer is we try and measure it in lots of different ways. And it's the same with happiness as well when we do that.
Thank you for your talk. I'm really interested in the qualitative dimensions to the relationships. For example, like what kind of intergenerational relationships you studied, and then also cultural values. It could be that in an Italian community, family is valued more than, say, with WASPs.
Yeah.
So there are different cultural, religious shapings of how one can connect and the kinds of conversations one can have that actually connect as opposed to disconnect.
Absolutely. So this is one regret I have. The book that I described, The Good Life, came out in January. Bob and I are quite proud of that book. We worked really hard on it, and we're pleased with the reaction. The one regret I have is there's an analogy I'd like to use, which is that relationships are kind of like food for us. We all need it we need that nutrition. But the flavor of that food is different depending on the culture that you come from. So there's no question that the quality of our relationships are in part influenced by our culture. They're also influenced from our family of origin and things like that. But we all need at some more core level, some basic relational needs satisfied. And that's what we're trying to highlight in this research and in the book that I described. We do get more qualitative. We haven't looked so much at the ethnic origins of the sample, although they're really interesting. To students today, that's sort of boring ethnicity in some ways, but I think it's really interesting. Lots of immigrants from Italy, lots from Ireland, poor areas in Europe that came around the turn of the century to the US. So that's an area that hasn't been well researched from these data, but they're there for someone to look at.
I have to say that here at the back, we assumed that those pictures were correct, and that one person was Italian of origin, and therefore that explained completely why they were really keen on the family. So we may have been wrong, hence the sort of previous question. But if you look at everything, including, of course, happiness, which is important, particularly later in life.
Can you talk up a little?
Yeah, but happiness, which is important later in life,
Yeah.
connections and so on. But in reality, in terms of longevity, it comes back, really. The most important one is wealth and education. Is that right?
It's tricky, actually. So when you look at these risk factors, so I didn't put in wealth and education. In this sample, wealth has very little prediction on happiness in life, but it does have a clear prediction to how long they live, right? There's a 10-year gap. I didn't put it in those terms, but the inner city boys are living 10 years less. So really important factor. I think we're just beginning to capture the importance of relationships. And if I had longer, I would talk a little bit about why relationships are so important, but it's not just one route that they're influencing health. We're understanding more and more about how relationships actually get under our skin, influence our immune system, influence our epigenetic expression. So I think what we're going to find is that increasingly people are looking to connection to others as an important risk factor, even for longevity and late life health as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about gender differences in your sample. You mentioned that there were women, but I think probably not in the original sample.
They weren't in the original sample.
And whether that turned up later in terms of the results that you found.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about, the topics that I focused on today, the importance of relationships, are true amazingly across time, across ancestry, across culture, and across gender. That doesn't mean, again, that there are not differences in the nature of relationships. So if we look carefully in this study, there were more men than women in the study who late in life talked about having lost connections with others, college friends or kids from their childhood that they've lost touch with. Women were better at staying in touch with those friends across time. And that's consistent with a literature that's been around for a while, but those gender differences are narrowing, and if they're present still, they're present in very small sizes in younger generations. And the whole idea of gender, of course, is changing as well. But I would say the gender effects are smaller than we imagined when we began this work, not in our research, but looking across the entire literature. And it's particularly profound when you ask men and women or boys and girls about what's important to them about friendship. They say almost exactly the same things. It's about a sense of intimacy and being understood. It's very similar. That's a generational change. It's a big change, is what I would say.
So we have time for, like, I think you two had a question and you had a question. I think then we'll,
Again, thank you. Fascinating. I guess given the the emphasis on connectivity, were there any insights gleaned around partner selection?
Are you asking for a friend?
Yes, absolutely. My girlfriend's not here, right?
No, we haven't worked a lot on partner selection, and I think it's a really interesting topic, and the literature out there I think is kind of complicated. I'm going to tell you just one quick anecdotal answer. It's not the scientific answer, which is I've been really struck at the number of people that are lifelong friends with the person who was randomly assigned to be their roommate in college. So that's really interesting to me. Really interesting. Of course, there are parts of the world where arranged marriage is still around and it works well in some cases, not well in others. Marriage in Western countries works well in some cases and not well in a lot of cases. So I don't know that we really know about the selection stuff yet.
There seems to be a growing emphasis on storytelling. Particularly, it was around before, but post-pandemic, I mean, in politics, in social, in community organizing, in marketing, in business, how does this, or does this at all fit into the models you've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I think stories connect us, right? They're often about commonalities that we had. I began by stories, partly trying to connect with an audience that was outside my neighborhood in social science. So stories are a way to connect ourselves with each other. I think I'm the director of the data science program at Bryn Mawr College, and stories are pretty important when we tell data. So, you know, I have interesting conversations with economists in my life outside of here, and many economists are trying to describe trends. The conversation here is much more about trying to understand the nature of those trends and trying to think about mechanisms. So stories to me are really important, particularly when we talk about data, but they're also important in terms of connecting with others. So stories engage us, they should be things that we can relate to, and they animate you know, information that we're trying to convey. Yeah, that was partly why our book has done okay, and I think part of it is that we tell some stories in that book.
Thank you very much. This is really fascinating. Just a quick question, which is like bothering me as to the causality. I mean, I was imagining that a person who is very miserable sort of chap is unlikely to make many friends.
Yeah.
So which triggers what?
Yeah, so this is a question about causality, a good social science question here. And what I want to say is it's likely to be bidirectional, that happy people have a higher chance, a better chance of making connections with others, and vice versa. People who are unhappy can have more difficulty. What we've done in our research and what other people have done is try and look across different types of research. So some of this is intervention research, which is experimental, giving people skills to get better at relationships, and we see some improvements in their mood. Some of it is animal research. You can look at how mice or other rat pups are reared, and you can change the nature of that rearing. So I think we're at the point, I feel pretty confident, otherwise I would not have written this book, where we can talk about connections and happiness, connections and physical health, as kind of like when we're talking about smoking and health, and the smoking company said there's no causal link, and scientists said the accumulation of evidence is clear, there's a causal link there. But it goes in both directions, so it's important, the point that you're making. It's not simply one direction. And probably it's also synergistic, we hope, as well, right? You get happy, you get more relationships, that has benefits. So that's the idea. Done?
Hello. Oh gosh, sorry, that's loud. Just to say that we're going to try and start in just a couple minutes, start back up again at 4:10.
Really interested in figure 14.B. Right. That's about page 65. I don't want to go through the whole. So wait, what if I just do? How do I advance things?
You could do that, or this.
Or
quicker.
this.
Yeah.
This is going to start.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
supposed to. That's okay. No, but nobody. They're all on break.
Say that we're gonna start.
Oh, you're going to say it now.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. I don't want to be the bad guy.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. We're going to get started now. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. It's great for me to be able to honor Ned. We were colleagues. Mike? Wait, it's on, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Can you hear now? Yeah. Okay. No, it's a great opportunity to be here. I was in this very house some years ago, and Ned was my senior colleague, although actually I voted on your offer. I don't know if you knew that. Columbia at that time had assistant professors voting on tenured offers. So I was in the meeting, and we were very glad. We heard about a guy who was commuting to Pennsylvania from the east side, and the Philosopher's Express, I think, was the name of the train. And so Ned seemed like an opportunity, and so we grabbed him. And I learned a lot from him while I was here, and I've continued to learn from him. So it's a great chance to be able to come here and talk on an issue that relates to the conference in a very general way. Earlier, we heard Thomas Piketty. Oops, this is kind of, I guess it'll hold up. Or maybe we can say, now we're rocking. No, sorry, bad joke. But talk about the welfare state, and he sees the welfare state as the savior of the defects of capitalism. So I want to talk about something that I got into almost by accident, but now working with my colleague at the Rockwell Foundation in Copenhagen, we made a comparison of how the US welfare state differs from the Danish welfare state in terms of outcomes, in particular child development and really forming, creating or eliminating inequality. And so this paper is a follow-up from that study, but it's motivated by some facts that I'll show you. So the welfare state is regarded as a Scandinavian welfare state is regarded as a paradigm for promoting equality and social mobility. People like Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, but many, many others have looked to the welfare state institutions, and they're very generous. I'll just go through what they are. But this is the curve that many of you look at when it's much in discussion in the so-called intergenerational mobility literature. And that's a relationship between the income of the child and the income of the parents. That's what the beta is. And this graph actually graphs beta against another measure at the bottom here on the x-axis of inequality. That's inequality in family income. And the pattern has been established in many different empirical papers. Korak in particular has done a lot of work on this, showing a general pattern that beta, which is a measure of the strength of family ties across generations, is related in a way that beta is higher, the tie is stronger in countries and regions where the inequality is higher. So that's received a lot of attention, huge amount of attention. And I want to look into this relationship. And so when people look at this curve, you'll see, oh, look, definitely the Scandinavian countries are low in terms of inequality, the Gini coefficient. They're low also in terms of beta. And so there are multiple interpretations of this relationship. One is basically to say, oh, look, then this inequality measured by the Gini coefficient is going to be a cause of why there's more or less mobility. But there's a second way to think about it, which is to say, look at the equation at the top of the page and solve it out as a stationary state difference equation. And then you'll see, well, you know, beta should be related to the inequality, the variance of the income. So if you just look at the variance of Y1 and variance of Y0, take it in steady state, there's a strong relationship. So this curve by itself doesn't prove anything, although many people interpret it one way or the other. So what's the source of the success of the Danish welfare state? We're talking really about Scandinavia, but our data are from Denmark. So I'll talk about that. Recent Danish cohorts are doing more or less the same as their parents. And that's unlike what's going on in the United States. It's documented by Chetty and many others. But Denmark is a very interesting laboratory for understanding inequality. Partly the data availability is fantastic. We're able to look at individual earnings trajectories. We have full life histories. We know a lot about peers. We know a lot about schools. We know a lot about health and so forth and so on. So we know, as we've heard already today, that about the Scandinavian welfare state, that reducing inequality is a major goal of the welfare state in Scandinavia. Gunnar Myrdal and others pioneered this. And so what I found very interesting, I mean, there are multiple explanations for that graph that I just showed you. And the question is, what do we know about the determinants of this inequality and social mobility? And so one thing we found that everybody knows, and Bernie Sanders in particular has put this out, but many, many others, there's a high level of social services in Denmark. And in fact, in the law, equality in services offered is mandated. So we know there's universal health care, teachers are paid the same everywhere with a kind of cost of living adjustment, there's free daycare, there's free college, and in many ways, it's a much greater social cohesion. And so what we find is that post-tax and transfers, income inequality is very low compared to the US. So what we found, though, is a little bit surprising. The question that I really want to pose is how much of the equality that we saw and how much of the intergenerational mobility that we saw is actually due directly to investments created by the welfare state. In other words, the skills, the free education, the child care, the support for working women and so forth, and how much of it has to do with tax and transfer policy. And what we actually have found, just to start off, is that educational intergenerational mobility is remarkably similar in the US and Denmark. Very surprising. And what we also found, and this really surprised us, and it surprised a lot of Danes, by the way. I'm famous in Denmark for this work. Denmark is not a big country, though. So I'm going to try to bring it over here. But what we found is there's substantial skill and education gaps across families by background. And so what we find, and I think it's important to really master this, because I think there's a lesson here for how we combat inequality, and it'll link to some of the earlier themes about the causes of inequality. The advantages from the universal access are basically harvested more by the advantage compared to the disadvantage. You say, why is that? It seems crazy. There was a lot of discussion about public programs, and the idea was equal expenditure. We spend the same amount of money on this school or that. That's mandated. All schools are getting the same per capita income. But what we find is that parents, even though they're given equal opportunities to use these services, use them in a very different way. There's a lot of information. In the literature, it's called the Matthew effect, although actually the original origin of the Matthew effect is here at Columbia in a totally different context. But now it's meant by used in the sense that affluent rather than the disadvantaged are the ones who are benefiting. So there's a lot of sorting and there's a lot of use. So family background plays a very strong role. And so using this kind of analysis, what we do, and using this kind of data, we want to look at the power of place. That's received a lot of attention in recent work. Neighborhoods, I'll show you a couple of graphs you've probably seen on the New York Times. That, you know, there is a sense that neighborhoods matter. Where you come from matters. And people have used the phrase, zip code is destiny. That's a phrase you'll hear said. So there is a real power of place. But one thing that we've investigated, beyond the notion that somehow this community, what is it that the neighborhood's doing? And how is it the neighborhood got to be the way it was? And what we document in a series of studies, and I'm just summarizing them, is that families purposely choose neighborhoods and the timing of moves. And so choice is not random, and that's a huge question here. And some of the work that's been out there talking about exposure effects, people have looked at, said, okay, look, the longer you live in a good neighborhood, the better the kid is in terms of later life outcomes, and therefore that's part of the advantage of a good neighborhood. So there are strong family income gradients, and there also turns out, even though teachers are paid all the same, they're sorting by teachers into more advantaged neighborhoods. Now, why is that? If all teachers are paid the same, there's a non-market way to clear, non-price way to clear the market, and that is they get better students. Teaching better students, if anybody here teaches, you know that better students are a real advantage to teaching, and especially now at all levels of education. So payments to teachers differ, but now in terms of the quality of the students taught. They sort. It's their sorting that's going on. And it's not that they're getting paid any more money. So the argument that I really want to make today, I want to make it briefly here, is that a central premise of the welfare state is the equality of access, which is mandated in Denmark, does not imply equality in the use of services. And that's found repeatedly. I'll give you some other evidence across the way. Matthew effects, those who are very, Merton, of course, is famous for his work on Matthew effects in science and science scholarship, but this is Matthew effects more generally defined. So what we find is that parents reinforce public services delivered, that they pick the neighborhoods, and they enforce the delivery of services. And what we found, and my co-author, Rasmus Landeso with Christian Carlson, has shown that in Denmark history, we have data going back to 1915 up to the present, that the move in Denmark to universal access, rather than focus on targeting disadvantaged children, actually increased the dependence of a child's educational status on affluence, because the parents are better able to utilize these equally provided services. So equality in provision is not the same as equality in use. And there's a lot of sorting going on, and this is something that really doesn't receive enough attention about the sorting that's going on and what the housing market is really doing in terms of sorting people into these different different places. So sorting is a big story here. And the choice of the neighborhood has a powerful role in explaining, and this purpose of selection is a major theme. And so we can look at a lot of things here. The data I mentioned, I can't go through all the details here, but we have a lot of data on father income. We know the family income, we know lifetime resources, and we have a lot of ways to compute welfare. So we know consumption, we have assets, we have inclusive measures, not just the kind of measure I showed you in the Gatsby curve, but measures in terms of lifetime wealth. Okay. So what do we know about Denmark and the US? So remember this massive welfare system in Denmark and relatively skimpy system in the US when you compare. So this is a graph that actually shows you the relationship between ability and high school completion. And this is in US on the left side and Denmark on the right side. The scales aren't quite the same, and this looks maybe a little fraudulent, but it really is the case that they're very similar if you adjust them on the same scale. And what you find is that each quartile of ability, and that's what AFT is, that you'll find there's a gradient, that richer families are the ones more likely to have their kids go to school for the same ability of the child. But that pattern is very strong in Denmark as it is in the US. If anything, it's slightly stronger. And the relationship between test scores and parents' income rank is also more or less the same in Denmark and the US. Again, very surprising in light of the equality of services provided. And there are substantial gaps across life outcomes, across children of mothers at different educational levels. And here, the US is much like Denmark. So just give you an example, starting with birth weight. If you look at the dots here, the birth weight is higher for parents where the mother's college educated, and the birth weight is low for the blue dots, and this is going to be a pattern. The same notation will be used for a whole series of outcomes. And so in terms of early child health and so forth, there are substantial gaps by education. This is the US data. There are a lot of measures we can take on language, sociability, criminal activities, years of schooling, wage earnings. The ranking is there. And we even look at survival to age 60. Now, if you look at the Danish counterparts, I really should put these side by side, but I really didn't, sorry. What we do see is gaps that are more or less of the same magnitude in terms of birth weight, admission to neonatal wards, look at assessed skills, income, and mortality. And so the Danish gaps are there over a lifetime, even though their system is far richer. This is Bernie Sanders' favorite city, country, sorry, more or less a city, Copenhagen. So there's lower income inequality and greater social mobility in terms of income is not skills-based. That's the thing that we found. That what we found is essentially there are some important differences in family background. So the question is, why do these gaps arise? And we'll argue that it's really more or less tax and transfer system-based equality. And I'll show you what's going on here. The major contributors to inequality suggesting, well, I just repeated this. If you look at the amount of equalization of expenditure, the dotted line is the graph of expenditure per capita in all of Denmark. It's very concentrated. It's not spiked at one point. But if you look at the US, that big flat curve there, big wide curve, that is much more dispersed. So that's an idea. And so we know, for example, from the work of Chetty, there's been a lot of work, Chetty and his group at Harvard, there's been a lot of work looking at the rank of a child and the rank of the parent's income. And so the higher the beta, the lower the level of mobility. So this is kind of like a rank version of that curve that I showed before, where the parental rank is in the national distribution versus the child's rank in the national distribution. So what we find is that a higher beta means less mobility, just like in the Gatsby curve. And so this is a curve that's made its way all around the world, and people have fit versions of this, not just in the US, but also in Denmark. And you can see the stroke belt, the black belt. You can see that really some of the poorest areas are those that show the least mobility. Very consistent with the Gatsby curve calculation. Now you get similar variation in Denmark. I won't show you, and I'll show you a version that's more focused. But the question then becomes, what is the power of location? Why do we get these location effects? And so the power of place receives a lot of attention, especially in sociology, but even now in economics. That's the zip code is destiny. And so the question really becomes, how much of location is a result of parental choice? How much of parental influence playing a role? And I actually find it plays a very strong role. Let me give you an idea. Parents are picking neighborhoods. And so what we can see is that this is from Chetty's work, for example, the 2014 paper. And what we see is upward mobility is associated with the Gini coefficient in different regions within the United States. These are commuting zones. And so we're getting something like the Gatsby curve, but with reversed coordinates. And if you look at the same curve in Denmark, it's the same. I mean, literally, the slope is the same. You have the same relationship between inequality and mobility. So that the lower the inequality, the greater the upward mobility, okay? So neighborhood effects in Denmark. Now, what do we know? Denmark is still an open society. There's lots of choice and so forth. So if we look across neighborhoods, we can see the fraction of mothers who smoke during pregnancy and by wage earnings prior to childbirth. And we can see very, very different neighborhood patterns. And what we also find, we don't have to go into it, is that it turns out that the more advantaged neighborhoods in Denmark have lower IGEs. I'll show you that in a minute. But the crucial thing that I really want to emphasize is not some detail about IGE statistics, but looking at sorting and segregation. In the US, sorting is very high. So if you look at income segregation across regions, so we can see there's a pattern. If you look at the bottom curve, that's a curve measured in 1970. And the more you shape the curve, and this is a measure then, this is so-called tile index of inequality, that we can see that segregation patterns are increasing, and they're particularly pronounced at the two extremes, very low and very high. So there's a lot of sorting going on across these neighborhoods. If you look at Denmark, it's very similar, and the pattern is the same. And we look at other countries, the pattern has been the same. So one of the important issues is the sorting that's going on. So I'll skip this, but we have a whole time series of sorting by different neighborhood characteristics. And what we can do, and we have done, is look at how much people are paying, how much parents are paying for better neighbors and students who are better peers in the sense of test scores and backgrounds. And it's a substantial price. I'll just give you an example of one thing that happens. And we can look at the choice of neighborhood and the choice of housing as an investment. And we can compute its return, and we do. But here's an example. If you look, for example, of the house value by the average teacher quality, remember, salaries are the same. So this is not a case where we're going to solve the problem by paying teachers more or paying them less. They're paying the same. But the sorting goes on as a natural mechanism. High quality teachers actually want to be in neighborhoods with more affluent children because they're more motivated. So what we found, and this is something that's ignored in a lot of the current literature right now, is that when people have been studying neighborhoods, they don't ever ask the question, well, how did people get in the neighborhood in the first place? And there's a whole line of work that essentially says, oh, you know, we can control by some technique or other for this purpose of choice. And so what you see, just as a fact, that more educated people, everybody is actually sorting before children enter school. You know, it varies depending when you do it. But if you look at years to the birth of the first child, there's a sorting that's going on by the more educated people. And the family moves aren't random. And so this is the graph I was talking about from Chetty. This essentially gives you an idea of what the rank is and the age of a child when parents move. So what it's telling you, if you look at this graph, is that there's more mobility the longer the parent has lived in the neighborhood. That's a high quality neighborhood, okay? So that's that linear relationship. And that's very heavily featured in this work. So what we did, and what I should say my colleague at the University of Chicago did, is raise a different question. Well, this kind of graph has received a lot of attention. Exposure to neighborhood makes the life of the child. So he asked a question. Suppose we looked at the birth weight of the child. The birth weight, before the kids had any exposure to the neighborhood. Maybe the kid was born in the neighborhood, but that's not the kind of exposure that's talked about in this literature. And so you get almost the same kind of relationship and almost the same strength. And you get it for birth length and so forth. So there's a lot of selection going on, and where the selection is coming is family purposive choice into these neighborhoods and parents sorting in the neighborhoods with people like them. So there's a lot of evidence on mobility. Educational mobility, I already mentioned there's a pattern that the move to universality actually in Denmark led to greater relationship between parents' background and child's background. So anyway, I won't show you that, the universality. And whatever we do, whichever way we look at it, that the children, even though they all have access to the same resources, the more affluent children are doing better. And this has been found in studies in Germany and so forth and so on. A lot of these Matthew effects are very powerful. So I'll skip past this as I'm running low on time, but I can make these slides available. So again, I would argue that the policies that aim very early on and sort of make the parents more wise in picking neighborhoods and maybe influence the children's early years have a real potential just based on a large body of evidence. So what we know though, and this is what the study did on educational mobility, that targeting disadvantaged children yields the highest benefits. So the idea of the universality, the kind of Max Weber kind of dream, I guess, and many people still advocate it, we know when we study it that targeted programs are the most effective. And that's what the Danish experiment did, and it's been found in other countries as well. So let me talk about one other set of factors about lifetime mobility. Namely, that when people look at measures of mobility, they look at measures of current income. And those graphs that I showed you are comparing people who are roughly age 35 when the parents are age 35 to the age when the children are age 35. So you want to align the cohorts. So you're comparing comparables, or so they claim. But of course, anybody who knows about the way the world is working and evolving is the world's becoming much more educated. And the world, many more people. So the whole childbearing process and the lifetime earning process has changed tremendously over the life cycle. So aligning in that way is not particularly wise and actually distorts things. So what we also want to do is say the lifetime measure isn't what we're really interested in. What we're really the current measure, what we want to come up with a lifetime measure. And so what we want to do is see how important, when we can construct lifetime measures, as you can with Danish data, how important this is. And so here I'll just venture into a little bit of economics and use this as a tool. So what the typical tool is to say, okay, I'm going to look at current income. I'm going to say, how does the income of the father correlate with the income of the son? Now, again, okay, well, it's not really father-son anymore, and it's not even the same age anymore, because literally the kids started later. I mean, literally, marriage has been postponed, fertility has been postponed, and that's a major part of social mobility, actually. In fact, it's a whole other public policy issue about how credit market interventions could affect this kind of mobility question. So what we do is we use the stochastic discount factor, and that's a way for us to judge uncertain income streams. Ned has a famous paper way back when, 1962, Econometrica, looking at uncertain income streams using dynamic programming. That was the legacy of his years at Rand. And so we're going to use similar techniques here. But what we're going to do is going to look at expected lifetime wealth. And by that, I don't just mean discounted future earnings. I mean discounted, adjusting for risk, and allowing for credit constraints. So we can't allow then for market reforms to affect social mobility, and we find they do. And so here's lifetime expected wealth, and that would be the standard notion. But the stochastic discount factor is this ratio of the marginal utilities given the agent's information sets that we can then find, you can use that to discount future income. And so what we're doing then is we actually do construct information sets. A way of doing so, we can use something that economists would know as a Sims kind of causality test. And we can then determine what is known to the agent each time and come up with a lifetime evolution. So instead of having a one-time shot relationship, we can see how the wealth of the child at a given age corresponds to the lifetime utility at another age. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'll show you some results. And so what we find is when we use these measures of lifetime wealth, perturbed in different ways, and we take into account welfare, consumption, we take into account labor supply, we take into account uncertainty, and we allow for credit constraints. So these are usually the factors that are totally ignored in the literature on that Korak curve that I talked about. And of course, we also then move beyond the individual to the family. So when you use family measures alone, that makes for a greater IGE, higher, less mobility. And when you use the lifetime measures, the long-term lifetime measures, the IGE goes up even further. So long-term measures of lifetime welfare are much higher than we think. Whereas before we had 0.2, now we're about 0.6. And what's interesting about this, though, is we can compute these factors. They're identified non-parametrically, so we can do this. And what we can do then is look at the experience, the welfare of different cohorts of Danes and people who face. So this is really the plot of the stochastic discount factor at different ages. So remember, children, one of the findings that I'm not going to go dwell on it, but one thing that's very interesting is that some of the most credit-constrained people in the society are the most educated. Now, that sounds completely crazy, because we think of credit constraint as being just a level of income. The trouble is that these people who have very highly educated, very able people have very steep earnings profiles. So they're actually going to earn a lot more. You have a surgeon who's just out of medical school, you can't get a loan against your future income. So they're fundamentally constrained. And actually relaxing that constraint is another margin of power. And some of those constraints were relaxed, and that's what we go across cohorts. So if you look, for example, here about the earlier cohorts, the solid line versus the later cohorts, they obviously don't overlap perfectly because of data limitation. But what you find is generally the stochastic discount factor is going down, which is associating with less discounting of the future, and therefore higher income. And that's also associated with the variations in risk due to social policy. And also the lending market moved very favorably towards housing in the later period of this sample. So the younger cohorts have benefited from reforms in the credit market. So what we find then is that lifetime measures of wealth are giving us a somewhat different story. Actually, the greatest IGE, if you want to just do IGEs, and looking at lifetime wealth, is the strongest for the low-income people, not the high-income people in terms of wealth. So let me just conclude some main factors and why I think it's important. People have talked a lot about capital. And we know, for example, a big criticism of the Piketty book was that a big chunk of his capital was housing capital. And people said, whoa, that capital's bad. So that kind of you think these plutocratic billionaires are clipping their coupons in some French Riviera estate. But actually what this is the growth of a middle class that's able to buy houses, and there's a huge growth of capital stock. But the housing market is not just playing the role. That point has been made in previous reviews of that work, so that it's a very different image of that, and saying, capital is playing this kind of 19th century view of how capital and labor. It's a much richer view that what's going on is that we have more affluent people, more educated people, and those educated people are actually now being able to borrow and so forth and so on, but they still face limitations. And the reform of the credit system is such, and the whole form of education system, is that life cycles are being postponed. People are living longer, They're starting later in life, they're having their children later, and of course they're also having fewer children as a result. And so what happens then is that we think about this housing stock and the choice of a neighborhood. It is a choice. It's not just that I randomly arrived at a zip code and that zip code caused my harm. We want to look at what is going on in the zip code. And what's going on is basically parents are sorting purposely, and more educated, more motivated parents are choosing that. And that sorting process is actually going forward into the future. And it's actually accelerating, if anything, as we get it, because of the housing market. And then I mentioned that the credit market constraints have been relaxed too, so that some of the more affluent people who might not have been able, some people who might have bought a house in another generation now can buy that house because credit markets were improved a lot, down payments and so forth. And then finally, we can measure how much risk has been reduced, because Danish social policy did reduce a lot of labor market risk. And as a result, those stochastic discount factors went up, which means your future wealth, you were discounting it less. So you were actually better off. We have a cardinal measure here of utility, but I'm not going to give it to you. So let me just summarize. I think the study of Denmark is fascinating. And to me, it's fascinating because I think it gives us a deeper understanding of inequality and what's going on. And I think what we find is that a big chunk of the mobility, that higher income inequality, is tax and transfer induced. And I know there's a recent paper that claimed otherwise, but if you want to talk about it, I'm more than happy to talk about that paper because I don't think it's correct. But nonetheless, I think what we see then is these measures are showing very, very strong. And so even though these policies, these are all the policies that people talk about, universal pre-K, equal pay, that's all true in Denmark. And yet you're producing outcomes that is comparable to what's going on in the US in terms of parental influence on child outcomes. That staggered me. It still does, to be honest. And so we can see then this kind of sorting process going on is a major form. So in addition to capital and labor, the kind of traditional items on the table when we study inequality and growth, I would want to think about how we might think of not just human capital, but also credit markets and how housing and access to housing and sorting is going on as a major determinant of inequality. So we can stop at that point. So thank you very much for your attention. What? Go ahead.
Do you observe quality of the teachers?
Yes.
How do you measure teacher quality?
See, one thing about the Danish register data, I mean, this is like almost ideal data. We can follow everybody from birth. I know what their grades were in high school. I know what their grades were in college. I know everything about them. So actually, I could tell you whether or not they were sick. I know their health records and so forth. So I'm literally able to follow. This is the dream of a life cycle economist. Ned wrote about, you know, these small life cycles, life cycle consumption. I can access. I also have wealth measures. So we can get asset measures. We can get housing values.
Of the teacher?
No, of course we know their test scores. Oh, the teacher's test scores.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
We know it for each teacher. We also know the test scores for each student, so we can measure peers. So when you go to the neighborhood, there are two levels of peers. There's one level of peers, which is basically the peers in the school system.
Mm-hmm.
There's another level of adult peers, you know, the it takes a neighborhood notion.
Yeah.
And that it actually, you know, the neighborhood that parents are going into, and we can also measure that. And that's going up too in terms of quality, in terms of sorting by background.
So that you could sort for both higher teachers,
Yeah.
for better peers for the students,
Yes, exactly.
and better parents. for the-
Exactly.
of the
And so we can
students.
actually, I mean, I don't have time to do it, but we have lots, we have done several papers where we've looked at the amount of investment in schooling, coming through buying into a better market. And just as a footnote, for some of the economists, there's this so-called Thibault model, which everybody writes about, and so forth. The Thibault model is a model where people sort in the neighborhoods based on so-called local public goods, and that's schooling, and usually in that model. So the idea is, well, you sort in there and you get a higher quality. Teachers are paid more, and all that leads to higher student quality. Teachers are paid the same. yet the quality is very different. And so a lot of the TIBO effects are neutralized. What we can estimate is what the value of those peer effects are. Literally, how much they're willing to pay to get into those neighborhoods and into those schools. If you want, I can talk about each of these papers, but it literally allows us the way that these neighborhoods have changed and the way that sometimes schooling boundaries are changed by legal regulations or expansion of the neighborhood. And so children are moved into one neighborhood or another. So we can do an evaluation of exactly what the value is of that neighborhood versus another. And there's a lot of compliance, so people aren't moving away. So that's, question, yes. Oh, Pierre Andre. Oh.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much. That was illuminating. One possible relationship between cross-sectional inequality and human capital investment is, to some extent, inequality reflects differential returns to human capital investment, which means that less inequality, like in Denmark, should in principle reduce incentives to invest in human capital.
Well,
do we see evidence of this?
We do have evidence in a different program. There was a program, it was very interesting. We looked at a program that was designed to subsidize disadvantaged youth. These are less educated youth, for example. And so what we found is that these programs subsidize their workplace training and subsidize their labor market participation. It was more like an EITC program in the US. But what it did is it led them to reduce their opportunity in school. They simply dropped out of school and they participated in these programs. So there's this negative effect. So subsidizing, in the Phelps volume that was referred to earlier, the subsidizing work and making work pay, I have a paper, which nobody reads, but it's a good paper. And it shows, it shows that these subsidies can actually lead to poverty traps. Because people go to work, and if, as a result of going to work, you don't go to school and you don't make investments, you can end up poor. You earn more money today, but you end up poor tomorrow. And there's some evidence for that going on. But yes, there are strong, because the tax rates are very high in Denmark compared to the US. And the disincentives are strong. So yes, I think that's a factor, for sure. Okay, two people, yes.
We hear from time to time, and I heard even today, that inequality is very much exogenous problem, that it is due to globalization and the technological change. But Denmark is very open and globalized economy.
Yes.
It's very much advanced technologically. It is knowledge-based economy.
Yes.
And still, I think that your research has proved that it is endogenous problem, that inequality is the result and outcome of the system and the political commitment. But my question is how much it is correlated? Is there correlation between inequality and the size of economy? Denmark is small. It's just less than 6 million people. So US is 50-fold more populous country.
Trade and
but you have countries across Baltic, like for instance Estonia, which is even less populous, which much higher inequality. So how much this inequality, which is an endogenous problem, is linked to the size of the population, to the size of the country?
Well, I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I'd want to unpack some of those questions. Because the thing about Denmark that's so interesting, some of these other countries, Latvia and Lithuania, don't have the same generosity of the welfare state, not by any measure. And so all I was focusing on was the notion of how, and Thomas early was talking about how the welfare state can undo some of this damage. And so all I'm saying is that if the welfare state is offering this kind of Weberian equal access to services, that's actually creating a force towards creating inequality in the sense of dependence of the family, the child's outcome on the family. Just that component. The other parts of your question I haven't addressed. I mean, we can talk about them one at a time, but I'd want to unpack them. But I think that the size of the country, I don't think it necessarily matters, but certainly these smaller countries are like the Scandinavian countries, all have pretty generous welfare systems. They're small, they have a lot of resources, they've been effective in the market, so forth and so forth. So they don't represent a global statement. All I want to talk about is this powerful role of the family. That's what I really want to, and Chiapperi is one of the world's expert on the family. He's the one who will give you the data on the true share of women in the economy, right? Maybe you should give a lecture later tonight at dinner. But seriously, I think I just want to put the family and the housing market, because the housing market was really tossed into this whole literature by Piketty about capital. It's housing. I think the expansion of the housing market is not a minus. I think it's a plus. However, the sorting is an issue. And when we reform credit markets, the ones who take better advantage of it, all these government policies, you know, Dustman has a paper on childcare in Denmark. There are a whole bunch of papers about Head Start programs in New York and so forth, all show the same pattern. That universality, when it's provided, the best, no matter what level of eligibility, the more advantaged take more advantage of those programs than the less advantaged. And that's a force. So the question is, if you want to tackle inequality, you should at least understand that. And it's not just a question of just moving people at random across neighborhoods. It's a question of informing the parents and getting them more actively engaged in that sense. And that's actually what I think whole body of other work shows is effective. But question, yeah.
All right, I think we have two more, this one and one more, and that's it.
Okay.
What about the function with parents of when the sorting of expectation and aspiration? You talked about the parents who are less advantaged, making less demands on the social services that are available to them.
Right.
So do you have a way of measuring that?
Yes.
And then what happens if a disruptor comes in and changes parental aspiration? And I'm thinking of Kennedy Odede in the Kibera slum in Nairobi. But
no, there's a lot of evidence on the point you're making, and it's done even in the U.S. Flavio Cunha, who's at Rice, and some of his co-authors have shown that some of them was disadvantaged people. These are living in Philadelphia and living in Houston. They're very, very disadvantaged, and partly they don't even know what's available to them. And they don't even have a clear understanding of what a child growth trajectory is normally. So providing information of that sort can be extremely beneficial. There's a real shortage of information. And I think that's amazing. But see, that changes the focus of inequality. It's not like I want to raise the income tax or redistribute the wealth. I think the wealth, I don't know, inherited wealth, I don't think is an issue, but I know a lot of people will disagree with that. But these other issues are real. Information shortage and parental lack of information. And I think that we know when we give it, it has very beneficial effects, like the program you were describing. And there are programs here in the United States, too, where we actually, you know, children filling out forms to go to college, getting them available to understand that they can get money from the college, scholarships that they're eligible for. They don't know it. Their parents don't know it. A lot of their peers don't know it. And so that's the information shortage that I think is a target for policy that we could really make a big gain. And the other policy I would make, I want to come back to the credit market, because I'm an economist, I like these stochastic discount factors. But it really is the case, though, that this credit market restriction is real. In a sense, it's postponing everything. So the neurosurgeon who's going to make hundreds of thousands a year will eventually get his hands on that money. He's not getting his hands on that money till he's about 40. He's having his kids earlier. And so you really might want to say, okay, even though we don't think of it as a child development policy or as a policy for reducing inequality, actually it is. If they can get their hands on that money, locate into better neighborhoods and so forth, they'll do it and so forth. Then you know, there's a series of information and credit questions that I think are valuable. And we can measure the expectations. We know what agents do. We have a way anyway of trying to measure. It's not perfect, I'm sure, but the point is that we have a way of measuring what at each point in time, what agents know and what they don't know about the future. The reason is we know the decisions they take. And then we can say, and we know what happened later. So we can ask how much of what happened later is based on the information that they had at their disposal. And a lot of people are gaining a lot more information. They're learning they're getting a better job, you know, that the credit market's going to be improved, that Denmark. And so there are ways to elicit information. But I claim that's a big shortage, which I would put on the table for inequality. He wants to stop me. The shortage is of time now, sorry. So I should stop.
Yeah.
One
so
more question. That's good.
Two very
Pipe
good
down.
questions. One of them is the locate the Shetty curve that.
Yeah, right. You went about birth weight?
No. What I wanted to ask about is in the disparity between the South and the North.
Correct.
That's not the kind of choice that you're talking about where it's very local or there's a lot less choice. People don't move that distance. You know, they'll move within a metropolitan area.
Well,
and
historically, they moved from the south to the north, big time, as you know.
yeah, but it's not the
Gary.
kind of, I mean, that's motivated by other things than the kind of family sorting that
Well, a lot of people were choosing, they wanted better schools for their kids, and that was a major motive in some of that motivation.
Okay, well, I guess, I think it's a lot less
No, I'm not
strong.
saying that's the full story. I agree. What I'm talking about now with this later data probably has not explained the full story, no. But I think it's really important to say, how do you get to where you are? Even within each of those neighborhoods, some of this like northern Alabama, Huntsville, places like that, you can do very well in those cities, even though the region shows this Chetty curve. Those regions are now huge areas called, commuting zones. And so the commuting zone for Chicago would include Gary, it would include Rockford, it would include big chunks of Kenosha. And so if you know Chicago area, it's huge, totally heterogeneous. So there are chunks within there where you could provide that kind of sorting, and they would be able to resort, right?
Yeah.
And
The other question I had was, there's a lot of concern about, the high housing prices
right.
Today relative to incomes have worsened the problem of upward mobility of poor younger generation.
Right.
So that the credit problem now has gotten worse. I mean,
Correct.
while capital accumulation has been good on average, the fact that housing prices relative to incomes have increased is now more of an impediment.
No, I agree with you on that. But that's where I would try to think about at least looking at the credit market and the way you could gain access to income that a lot of people currently don't have. That would be a partial offset. I don't think that's the whole answer, though, not by any means. But I agree with you. Yeah, housing prices, that's even more true in Eastern Europe, though, right? And a lot of places where you're having difficulty with fertility and the whole story there. So I agree, though. I completely agree. Okay, I'm monopolizing there. Sorry.
Last but not least. This one?
Yeah.
Yours is a Word document?
Yes, I think he knows.
Okay.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
All right.
That's it, right?
Now, and I move it by this chap. Oh, yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Or do you think?
All right, this is for you.
Or do you think it might go like this? I think that's. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Shall I?
Yes, please, yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be here, particularly because I'd like to think we are honoring Ned. And I was thinking, even as we were having dinner the other night, that back in 1965, when I moved from maths to economics, the first paper I was asked to read by my mentor and teacher, Jim Merlees, was a paper, short paper. And he said, well, you won't need to know much economics to be able to read this. Now, I didn't quite know what he meant, but it was the most elegant piece of work, one of the most elegant pieces of work I've ever read. It was almost a transcendental problem, and the author knew it, talked about the golden rule. And it was utterly simple and was connected to economics, even although the question was transcendental. So I read that and I thought, if this is economics, it's for me. Because it has the transcendental aspect, and yet it gives you some firm conclusions which you can use. And of course, disappointment set in pretty quickly after that. But my admiration for Ned has never abated. And I like to think that somewhere a good deal of my work on growth and development economics and the economics of poverty was inspired by his style of thinking, not necessarily the execution, because I moved in a very different direction. I like to think that what I'll be talking about now today complements much of Ned's early work in macroeconomics of the long run. And I am talking about the long run, and I want to first part concentrate on the global issues, and then you'll see how I naturally move to certain local problems. Now, it's not common to find a connection between the earth sciences and economics, but I pride myself in thinking that I have discovered one. From 1950 to 2020, the post-war period, this chunk of 70 years, has been absolutely extraordinary by any standard. Jeff Sachs pointed to a much longer spell of time in his talk, but even that growth is nothing like the last 70 years, and that has colored our perception of economic possibilities in a powerful way, and I'll be arguing in a very misleading way. Look at some of the statistics. Global GDP has increased more than 15-fold to over $120 trillion PPP. Per capita global GDP has increased more than 5-fold to some $20,000 PPP. Population has increased more than 3-fold from 2.5 billion in 1950 to 8 billion now. Life expectancy at birth has increased from 46 years to 72 years, and the proportion of people in extreme poverty has declined from more than 60% to less than 10%. Now, these are glorious pieces of information. I'm looking at the global figures now. I'm not talking about inequality. We have had a lot on that. I'm averaging it up and thinking in terms of the performance of the average person, if you like. Okay? 1950, however, was also the year which has now been officially declared by leading earth scientists as the year we entered the Anthropocene, that is the human-dominated biosphere. They did that by, what they do is, of course, to look at the signatures, geophysical signatures in the soils, in the water, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and so forth, and look at the concentration that has. So this huge, enormous success we've had in the statistics, as indicated in the statistics I've just quoted, has been achieved by an accumulation of produced capital, roads, buildings, ports, machines, and human capital, health, education, skills, and character is something I'd like to add. I have, but I forgot to type it in for this, because the character marries what I'm talking about with some of the earlier lectures we had this morning. But it has been accompanied by the accumulation of natural capital, wetlands, grasslands, mangroves, coral reefs, woodlands, forests, lakes, and such biomes as the atmosphere, the oceans, the soils, and the subsoil resources. As an indication of, that was an assertion, the accumulation, so let me give you some crude statistics on it. And the statistics are crude not only because it's extremely difficult, because of the heterogeneity of the Earth system and absence of prices in the market for so many of these goods and services, but also because economists have neglected these issues far more than they should have. So that everything is now really exploratory. The applied apparatus that we have in hand is exploratory in a way that, say, the kind of standard statistics in macroeconomics that we are familiar with hasn't, because there have been years and years and decades of work, millions of dollars of expenditure in refining the statistics. As an indication of this assertion that there's been a accumulation of natural capital, look at the rate of species extinction. It's estimated to be about 100 to 1,000 times the background rate of extinction of some 0.1 to 1 species per million per year. That's a huge increase. And you might say, well, I'm talking about wetlands and grasslands, mangroves, and now I'm talking about species, but there's a connection. That is to say, the productivity of ecosystems has been shown as one of the great achievements of contemporary ecology, to be positively contributed by not so much species diversity, but functional diversity of species. Okay? By one UN estimate, and here's another one, globally the stock of produced capital per capita doubled in the period 1992 to 2014. Human capital per capita increased by some 20%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. And here is the diagram which shows that. Now, the reason it's worth pondering over this is that, of course, the bottom curve, the one which has declined per capita natural capital, and we can go into how that's measured subsequently, but not quite yet. It's ideas to somehow value these natural assets, the ones I mentioned, attributing them to them accounting prices, not market prices. Everything I'll be talking about today is about accounting prices, largely because, of course, market prices are missing for many, many of these natural products. The reason it's worth pondering it is that the conventional measures that we use for judging the progress or regress of economies doesn't have depreciation in it. GDP, the rogue word in GDP is gross. It doesn't net out the depreciation of capital that accompanies production. So those successes that we looked at, the terms of GDP per capita, GDP in aggregate, didn't include in it the fact that in the process of this great success during the Anthropocene, last 70 years, we have been mining nature, trashing her. Okay. As GDP does not record depreciation of capital, growth and development economics and the economics of poverty should instead be built on the principle of asset management. And in a review that I produced for the UK government 2.5 years ago, and it will be published by Cambridge University Press next spring, I essentially tried to redirect growth and development economics and the economics of poverty towards the viewpoint that we are all asset managers, and we ought to recognize it as so. When I say we all, everybody, but everybody. The poorest household is managing its assets, the fisherman is managing his assets, the farmer is, and so are we. And assets mean, of course, stocks of capital. So we ought to move from flows, which is flow measures like GDP, to measures of stock. And the indicator that we need to use in order to judge the progress or regress of an economy should be an inclusive measure of wealth, again, using accounting prices, okay? That is to say the value, total value of the stocks of produced natural and human capital. Now, you might think that I've skipped social capital, an issue that cropped up earlier this morning in the context of the family, in the form of connections, and so forth. I haven't missed it out. The reason I haven't included it is that one could, in principle, do so, but in practice, it'll be absolutely impossible. Try and figure out the social, shadow accounting price of a household, as a household, as a unit, as a network. What they do is these intangible capital assets, like financial capital, for example, will be reflected, and the quality of those assets will be reflected in the accounting prices for produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. So an economy in which citizens trust one another will have a different set of accounting prices for the same quantities of these three types of capital assets as one which didn't, where there was discord. So these prices are carrying a huge amount of ethical and factual aspects, okay? Now the question is, I've just asserted inclusive wealth. The question is why? Why should we use it? And there's a theorem behind it. I'm a theorist, so just like There is a number. That was the great lecture we just heard. It was econometrics. And this is theoretical. Inclusive wealth corresponds to well-being across the generations. In other words, you give me a conception of well-being across the generations, whether it's utilitarian, deontological, doesn't matter, whatever it is, there corresponds a set of accounting prices for this bundle of assets, such that if you estimate inclusive wealth, then it corresponds to the conception of intergenerational well-being in the following sense. If the former increases over a period of time, so does the latter. And if the latter increases for a period of time, so does the former. It's an equivalence result. Now, in other words, we should be measuring the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations or the Human Development Index of nations. That's for sure. The trouble is, that's a Platonic idea. It's not going to happen. You can't possibly do it. There's just too much of heterogeneity in natural capital, even if you could swallow the idea that you can have accounting prices for buildings and roads and human capital and so forth. In natural capital, it's going to be proved extremely difficult. So what's the advantage of having a theorem? In my judgment, the reason theorists like myself are concerned with having theorems of this kind, of this pristine form, is that they tell you what we ought to be ideally seeking. Therefore, the moment we know it, we then start cutting corners, because we know it can't be achieved. But the cutting of the corners will be informed by the fact that you are cutting a corner. If you don't have a theorem, what you will be doing is to just beg, borrow, and steal from everything that you feel is worthwhile in life, and put that in and saying that constitutes welfare. And then you run with that. So I'm now going to spend the rest of the time speaking to one aspect of this inclusive wealth and concentrate on that. The biosphere is a self-regenerative asset, supplying us with a variety of services. Ecologists have concentrated on two partitioned nature's goods and services into two forms. I'm using nature and biosphere interchangeably. Sometimes I call her Mother Nature, because of my family background, I guess. One is the provisioning goods. These are food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceutical products, and non-living material. In fact, these are the goods which, with human ingenuity, we convert into what we call GDP. And that's been the point of focus of much of resource economics. Jeff Heel, who is here, my friend Jeff Heel and I wrote a book in 1979 concentrating on provisional goods, but the focus of attention in provisional good there was exhaustible resources, and then blending it into macroeconomics of growth and development. But there's another class of services, or goods, but services, I'm making a distinction between goods and services here, which ecologists call regulating and maintenance services. Climate regulation, decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, and pollination. These are amongst just, there's a lot more, but the difference between the two is really startling. And ecologists didn't really make much use of it. They recognized, they made the classification, but they didn't run with it. And what I'm going to be doing now is to show the central importance of this distinction. We have increasingly drawn on nature's regulating and maintenance services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods. These regulating and maintenance services are if you like, the basis on which the provisioning goods are, the mechanisms by which the provisioning goods are supplied by Mother Nature. Mathematically, you might want, if you want to think of the processes as being governed by differential equations, if you like, over time, then provisioning, we are looking at stocks of capital, which is I've been hinting at, I've been talking about, natural capital, but the functional forms which transform stocks of, today's stocks of natural capital into tomorrow's stocks of natural capital, that are the processes. So that's the way to think about it. These are the functional forms. They're actually driving the movement of the natural capital stocks. Okay? So that's one big difference. So we've increasingly drawn on these services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods by mining, quarrying, and otherwise transforming the landscape. As you transform the landscape to get, say, more of one type of provisioning goods, you forego some others. And of course, you're disrupting the processes themselves because the ecosystems are specified. The grassland offers a different sort of process, underlying different sorts of processes from a rainforest, from a mangrove forest, or from a coral reef, for that matter. So forests making way for agriculture and plantations, grasslands transferring to pasture lands are examples of land use changes which have been carrying out at a furious rate during the Anthropocene. There is an inevitable tension between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating maintenance services on the other. And that's the tension that I mentioned. The more you want the provisioning goods, you're going to be eating into the regulating and maintenance services, unless technological change comes in, and I'll come back to that, okay, our ways of doing things. But regulating and maintenance services are fundamental, without which we would have no provisioning goods. A second importance in the distinction lies in the fact that if you concentrate attention on provisioning goods, which the economics of climate change has, you're drawn towards the possibility of substitution possibilities. In fact, Jeff Fields and my book essentially drew attention to the substitution possibilities as a way of getting out of resource scarcities, and that was exactly correct. Unfortunately, in the case of maintenance and regulating services, those services are complementary to one another. They're not substitutable. You can't say I'm going to have a lot more of one type of service at the expense of the other, because they're coupled differential equations, remember. So it'll be disrupting the others as well. And that causes difficulties, serious difficulties, and our conceptual framework. So the idea that we can substitute our way out of resource constraint may be true in the case of provisioning goods up to a point, cleaner energy for dirty energy, that sort of thing, the sources of energy being different. But at the end of the day, they will all be eating into the maintenance and regulating services, and there the substitution possibilities are really very scarce. They are, in fact, complementary. Now, the global demand, and I've been concentrating, I've moved away from inclusive wealth. Why? Because I'm going to be decomposing it and looking at one component of it, having noted that, first of all, that it's such a Platonic notion that we should be seeking to unravel it. And I'm unraveling only one bit of it, which is, if I were a human capital expert, I would be unraveling the human capital component, but I'm not, so I'm not. Okay. The global demand for the human economy makes of maintenance and regulating services has in recent decades outstripped nature's ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. By one estimate, using land use changes for estimating changes in the flow of these services, the global demand today exceeds nature's ability to meet that demand on a sustainable basis. The ratio is 1.7, from which you now and then read we need 1.7 Earths to satisfy our requirements. Notice it's the sustainable basis. At any moment, of course, we can get away with 1.7 excess, but we do that by shrinking, creating a deteriorated biosphere. So the image here, the one I like to use, is it carries you, this imagery carries you so far, not completely, and I'll come back to that, but for the moment, think of this as a fishery. There is a reproductive rate, regeneration rate for the stock of fish. You can cull more than the net reproduction rate, but if you do that, the stock declines. So think of it that way. And that's essentially what's happening. So armed with that, I'm going to write down, I'm a theorist, so if you thought I was going to run away without an equation or an inequality, you would be surprised. So I would be surprised. So here we are. So I look at the demand, think of the demand for these regulating and maintenance services. By the way, I could tell the story in terms of provisioning goods also. I'm going to be concentrating on the other, because remember, the two are connected. So what goes for one goes for the other as well. If demand
exceeds supply for the provisioning goods, we have a problem. We'll have to constantly eating into that, or the demand goes for maintenance and regulating services, it eats into the provisioning goods. So what I want to do is to convert the human activities into the demand that we make, and then connect it with the supply source. And I'm going to do that in a very simplified form for our purposes, imagining that we have accounting prices so that we can aggregate all the way through. If you don't like the idea, and I don't either, then the inequality I'll be giving you will be a series of inequality, one per service. A bit like these planetary boundaries literature that the earth scientists have been talking about, which is a set of thresholds that we mustn't cross. So, but I'm going to be concentrating on an aggregate form. So I'm going to suppose that the total human activity can be expressed in terms of global GDP. We know it can't for reasons that were made clear earlier. Many things are missing in GDP. It doesn't matter. So long as I can concentrate on this, but you'll see I'll have a parameter which will be able to convert the misspecification. So if n is global population, small y is per capita global GDP, the product of the two is global GDP itself. And I'm going to be thinking of a parameter alpha, which is the efficiency with which biosphere's goods and services are converted into global GDP. That's going to be the critical thing. This alpha captures both technological possibilities, which was at the center of the discussions earlier this morning, but of course it also includes institutions. Okay, and I'll come back to this linkage. So alpha, if you like, is arrived at, is reflecting both the institutional structures of the economy in question, and they need not be optimal by any means. It could be an imperfect economy as much as you like. And of course, we are looking at a very imperfect economy. We've got an overshoot to explain and work with, okay? So ny divided by alpha is the demand we make on the alpha has the dimensions so that the left-hand side ny divided by alpha is the units are the aggregate of services. That exceeds the production of the service by Mother Nature, which is G of S. If S is the stock, G is the functional form of which yields the services, hence the allusion to the fishery model, because that exactly fits this, okay? So at the moment, the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side, and this is, of course, this is a statement of a particular point in time, say 2023, but of course, each of these things are part of a dynamical system. I'm not going to write that down. I have in the review, there are chapters in which I produce a complete capital model, which includes natural capital, to show how to think about forecasting of economic possibilities and conceiving economic possibilities, taking nature as essential. Now, the key thing here, and I'll be very brief because this is not the time to go into it in great detail, you might think, well, look, if there is inequality here, how do we close the gap? So if one wants to talk about sustainable development, the first cut must be to make that into an inequality, make it into an equality. Maybe even try and reverse it in order to let nature regenerate, investment in nature to regenerate. In any event, we can't allow that to. Now, this is where I've run some crude estimates of what would be required to hit the Sustainable Development Goals in 2030. And the minimum requirement would be a closing of this gap, which was not in the Sustainable Development Goals. They didn't cast the goals in line with what I've given you here, this inequality. It turns out that alpha, under projections of global GDP that are consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, alpha would have to increase in this next 7 years at a percentage rate 5 times higher than it's ever been, at least in the last 30 years. It's not achievable. And in other words, the Sustainable Development Goals are misnamed because they're not directing attention at this critical inequality. Okay. But there are problems. Now, the final point I wanted to make about this is, so there are ways, and thinking about it would be,
one obvious way would be to start investing in increasing alpha. So if you raise alpha somehow, then of course, given ceteris paribus, the left-hand side will be reduced. And of course, that's what the increasing alpha is, the mode of conduct in the economics of climate change, moving to more efficient methods of producing. Yeah. Okay? All right. So, but there are problems within problems. So I want to end quickly, so give you a sense of the problem. If you were to look at the national, I've been looking at global issues, but the United Nations Environment Program, yes, has done a countrywide balance sheet over of the ecological footprint. Remember, the NY divided by alpha could be read as ecological footprint. I should have mentioned that, but that's the commonplace way of thinking about it, as a function of income. So we have now data from countrywide ecological footprints, which shows, not as expected, that ecological footprint per capita increases with income per capita. And this is, of course, national accounts, but I'll be thinking in terms of persons. The problem is, again, this is not a subject for the faint-hearted. Everywhere there is a sort of a roadblock, is that it's strictly concave function, which means that there's a tension between sustainability and desire for equality. In other words, you will need to pay some more. You need to reduce GDP even more if you wish to both maintain an equality between demand and supply for nature's goods and processes and have greater equality. So there is a tension here. You can't, the reason is that while the rich certainly have a bigger footprint than the poor, at the margin, the richer households' footprint is lower than the poorer households, and that's what's causing it, okay? So you can't have everything, so to speak. Okay. Now, the other, and I'll end with this, the other, there are some sample of global policies that I ought to mention, and I'll do that in the next minute and a half. So general policy, which the New York Times in a skit on my review called "Pay for what you use," and that's exactly right. The whole point is that the market prices are zero for, say, the oceans, ocean waters, and yet there's a positive shadow accounting prices. So the specific ones, I'll mention two: enforce charges for the use of the oceans, transportation of goods, pleasure cruises, mining, fishing, and polluting. There's this huge open access resource sitting out there, and it belongs to everybody. It's no countries. It's a global commons, and it's free of charge. Trillions of dollars of goods and merchandise are shipped across the oceans, so we should be able to generate some rent, the right to do that, to carry that transportation. That revenue, which could be in hundreds of billions annually, could be used for obviously standards development purposes and so forth, but a critical one that I tried to emphasize in my review and in many talks I've given is that it could be used to pay countries which house the rainforests, for example, tropical rainforests, for example, for preserving them. See, may seem crude, but they have a right to say, why should we be looking after the whole of humanity? Brazil would say, our rainforests are ours, and we need to develop. That's been the standard argument. Because while it benefits them to have it, the world enjoys, it's a global public good. They're global public good. So we need, within nations, of course, now the practice of payment for ecosystem services is becoming more and more commonplace. The UK has it extensively, paying farmers to do this, that, and the other. And my thought was that we should now have an international institution established to do precisely that. And I'll end with a slightly bitter note, but if you work on this kind of problem, which is so problematic, you need to have a cheerful frame of mind, bent of mind, so nothing really disturbs me too much. But I've had now about 250 meetings since my review was published because there was a demand for it, to give Q&As, lectures, interviews, and this is one of the proposals that I emphasized. At every stage, international and decision makers, international organizations, political figures from a variety of countries said the world doesn't have an appetite for such an enterprise to establish such an institution. And I kept on pointing out that at the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Anthropocene, if you like, or predating the Anthropocene, Europe was in ruins, Far East was in ruins, and we created the United Nations, World Bank, IMF. These were all producing global public goods. The Marshall Plan, which was referred to, again, a global public action. But we now do not have the guts to save the planet. That, I think, is sad news. Thank you very much. Whatever. And there's, of course, dinner.
Yeah, sorry.
No, the drinks can't be postponed. That would be unthinkable.
Hello, Professor Dasgupta. Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to focus on one of the components of environmental degradation, which is consumption, which is especially relevant in rich countries. And I wanted to ask you, drawing on your own expertise and on the other talks, which also touched upon this relevant subject, how do you view, what are the prospects of reining in consumption given the fact that it's not a purely private reflection of private preferences, but it's also socially embedded? And yes, that's it.
Well, look, I can't respond to your latter question, although I would love to be able to do that. It would be presumptuous of me to, I'm not a political scientist. All I know is that Cambridge, even a small problem like a congestion charge in a heavily congested, beautiful city like Cambridge, was rejected because people didn't like to be taxed. Okay, so that's the second part. First one, it's a very good question because that's a very natural thing to do. You want to bring down the NY, if you like, somehow. And if you feel that's not going to happen, but at least conceptually you have a right to ask that question. If the rich are consuming so much as they are, because after all the inequality is a fact, so the context of that, what can you do? Well, I did this calculation. If you were to halve the per capita GDP of the OECD countries, that's say, as the economist likes to call it, a club of rich nations. Let's say if you halve it, then other things remain the same. The 1.7 would be reduced to 1.3, but it'll still be positive. So that's not going to do all the work. The work has to be done in other ways, raising alpha somehow. But alpha can't go to infinity. So the idea that you could have NY going to infinity while alpha goes to infinity, keeping the left-hand side finite and within bounds, that's not on. Because alpha going to infinity is equivalent to saying that asymptotically we can escape the biosphere. We can be free of it, asymptotically, at the margin. And since, well, I mean, Musk might think he can, but not we humans can't. So that's a problem. The other is, of course, to invest in S. That's green investment, if you like.
Thank you. I wonder if you could just comment. I can't help but just reminds me of sort of market externalities is the
yes, of course,
degeneration, and so we need to internalize them through taxation or incentives to work on that, and that's a big sell that, as you said, in Cambridge, they weren't able to sell. But do you think your theoretical work will help sell that? And the second aspect is, although it's theory, do you see this having any impact on, say, benefit cost analysis of natural resource issues?
Very good. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know. Having said theory, I was acting as a sort of a blushing bride. I don't mean that. I'm rather proud to be a theorist. Without theory, applied work has no meaning, because you don't know what even evidence means. Okay, so you've got to get the theory right. That's for sure. I'm concentrating on theory because that's where my strength is. The review is 610 pages long, and there's a heck of a lot of applied material. So that's point number one. Point number two is that, yes, there is a good deal of work in shifting attention towards these issues that's been going on since the publication, and some movements were there even before. For example, most countries now, at least of the countries that I know of, are moving more and more towards creating natural capital accounts. Okay, UK has it. Now, it's not to supplement GDP, and it shouldn't either. GDP is extremely useful for short-run macroeconomic management, that's for sure. But I'm talking about long-term macroeconomics, long-term growth prospects, and so forth. So there it's happening. Most recently, of course, the United States itself has come up with a document coming from the White House, redirecting social cost-benefit analysis to include nature services. It's not yet been published, but I endorsed it. I was asked to endorse it, and I have. So that's happening. Now, it's interesting, since you've asked, and I'll take half a minute, inclusive wealth might seem a new thing. It's not, because the way we evaluate projects is to look at the net present value of net flow of net benefits, okay? Social benefits, of course. But if you think about it, the discounted value of this flow of net benefits is a stock, because you're summing the flows. And it turns out that present value is in fact equal to the change in inclusive wealth that the project would bring forward. So if you accept the project because PV is positive, it means wealth is increasing. So yes, it's now a tidy theory in the sense that we now have a complete capital model to think about economic possibilities. One possibility, and I'll finish with that, because drink calleth, is alpha. I tend to think in terms of alpha, increasing alpha as technological improvements, and that's what the climate change economics has encouraged us to think. But of course, alpha has institutions built into it. So for example, suppose you could tax the oceans. Suppose you could then subsidize the holders of natural assets like the tropical rainforests. Then alpha would be increased because we'll be veering in a different direction, a different composition, different use of the assets that we hold, this asset management problem that we have. We'll be making natural capital more scarce, more valuable, more costly. So the direction of technological change will be one in which new technologies will be less rapacious in the use of nature. Because entrepreneurs have no reason to economize on nature, because nature is free, cheap. You want to economize on labor, hence the chainsaw, hence the bulldozer and everything. Now, some years ago, Joe may have forgotten, Joe and I published a paper in which I think is the first and maybe even the only analytical paper, which showed how an economy could absolutely veer off in a different direction through technological change, but we used learning by doing as a trigger mechanism. Now here, the insight there carries over to everything I've said. If the prices change, then incrementally the direction of technological change will be altered. And over the long run, we will see a different world that we can't conceive now, because what we see is what we have. And so the idea that, what do we do? What will the world be like if we actually charged or priced these unpriced assets? We don't know, because we are far off from it. But if you believe in decentralization, if you believe there are incentives to carry the thing, and the accounting prices are guiding in the right way, then it won't be a worse world, it'll be a far better world.
Thank you.
Ah, no, that's not mine.
I know, but do you want me to close it?
No. Yes, you can close it, yeah. Well, I want to thank the speakers we have heard today for their valuable presentations at today's conference. It has been an excellent conference, as I expected it would be. I always get very lucky about this. And I want to thank also the audience for their attendance. It's quite a good crowd today. Their excellent questions and their comments. Now, sadly, especially if I tip this over, but sadly, I must inform you all here, as the members of the members of the center and the foreign members of the center have already been told, that the offices of the Center on Capitalism will be closed as of May 31st, as ordered by the university. They have other uses they want to put that space to. So the center will cease to function at that time, but rest assured we're going to stay as busy as we can over this academic year. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone here who contributed, supported, and worked with me at the center these past 22 years to make the center a great success. Miranda Featherstone, who couldn't make it here today, Lydia Conklin, ditto, Francesca Mari also couldn't come, and Karen Lee. But Lizzie Feidelson is here, of course, and Catherine, my assistant Catherine Picula, is here. I want to thank especially Richard Robb for his immense support of the center's work over the past decade or two. I also want to take this opportunity just briefly to recall the history of the center. As some of you know, the center was imagined by Roman Friedman of NYU and me to maybe a lesser extent. It was conceived in the course of discussions that I had with several, going on, the development went on with conversations with several colleagues at Columbia. I recall meetings with Glenn Hubbard, Bruce Greenwald, Andrei Rapachinsky, and Richard Nelson, but it's very possible that I've forgotten the names of others. The center was founded in September 2001, when I won the support of the provost, Jonathan Cole, and Jonathan obtained the approval of the then president of Columbia, George Rupp. Rupp later commented to me that he was a theologian interested in capitalism and Luther, so I can have to imagine what would happen if he hadn't had those interests. I was amused, I was named the director, though I continued to teach my usual set of courses. The center began operating in tiny quarters provided by Jeffrey Sachs at the Earth Institute. After a meeting with me following his visit here, Peter Jungen brought these conditions to the attention of the administration and they wanted to act on it, but that was going to take some time. After a year or two, President Lee Bollinger was able to provide the center with grand space for the center's research center
at Columbia. He and Peter also provided early funding. Peter is has left it for the day, I guess. I am proud of the center's many achievements over these past 22 years, beginning with its annual conferences. Paul Samuelson was one of our first speakers. Paul Volcker was the main speaker on at least 3 occasions, and there were many other exciting conferences. One of them climaxed in Joyce DiDonato's moving rendition of Climb Every Mountain. And in recent years, Tunku, who was here this morning, Varadarajan, pulled up the center's journal, Capitalism and Society, to a high level, also with the help of Richard. The center has been a stage for debate over numerous issues: individualism, inclusion, poverty, satisfying work, the financial system, the environment, dynamism, capital, flourishing, and the good life. It has also been a hotbed for new ideas and testing of those new ideas, such as a theory of indigenous innovation and a model of the main effects from the slowdown of innovation over these past 30 or 40 years. While the timing of this event has been chosen by the university, the center, with this large conference today, and maybe a small conference in the spring, is going out on the top, like Ted Williams and Marie Callas. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Wow. Thank you so much. That's hugely touching. I'm very grateful. Let's get a drink.